I see what you're saying, kind of with like the guy entering the encampment, but I think that it's kind of problematic if people just get into a university and build like an area and tell people they can't go inside that area. And also, like in the video, it's hard for me to know whether they're really stopping him from the encampment. Because, like, I mean, and you know, you can look at it from my perspective because you look at that video and it doesn't seem like there's an encampment behind those people.
Yeah, they framed it in a way specifically so that it would invoke that response from people that are unfamiliar.
So you think that like basically they filmed it from a direction where
Oh
there
no,
aren't the
it's not that I think I know. I was
oh
there.
no, when did you go there?
I went there 3 days ago, I think, and he was there
Yeah.
actually even that day as well. He's been there every single day. So he's one of these broccoli-haired Zoomers that runs around and is like trying to use American foreign policy and active conflict to basically make TikTok clout for himself. He's also worked with groups like Stand With Us, which is a group that directly gets funding from the Israeli government. So like he has worked with the Israeli government to do propaganda already. But I'm sure this is a great career opportunity for him. That's why he's been on Fox News. There's videos of him like trying to debate and agitate teachers that are near the encampment. Even Sky News called him a counter protester and an agitator. Like he's like a known figure. This is not a random guy. That's also the reason why he is,
Mm-hmm.
at least for UCLA campus, he's the only video of like anyone even claiming that students are blocking people from going to campus because he's deliberately going up to the encampment in an effort to try to get into the encampment to start fights. When I was there, a bunch of Zionist counter protesters tried to do that as well. And the students were incredibly well organized, and they just set up a human chain to like they don't even like physically apprehend or remove people. They basically just body block them as though they are there, having a picnic.
Oh yeah, no, I saw that, and I think it was like I think 2 nights ago, not last night, whenever all this stuff got removed, but the night before. I mean, it was pretty obvious that like the Israeli or like Zionist or anti-Palestinian ones were the aggressors, and I think that that's a bad thing. I mean, I don't think that the guy is in the wrong though for being a counter protester or even for being an agitator. Really, it depends on how you define the word because
Oh, I,
I mean, that's his freedom of speech, and I feel like that's what's fair in the same way that it's fair for those other people to go and protest for Palestine.
yeah, but the difference
I
is
yeah,
the
go ahead.
difference is first of all, bear mace or mace in general is
Yeah,
illegal to bring to protest, and he's like flashing it. There's another video of the students literally he walks up to them when they're gearing up for the cops to show up,
yeah.
and the students say we are peaceful, we're peacefully protesting against the Israeli genocide here, like we see your bear mace, like please, you're making us feel unsafe. And he actually literally does not have a right to have that on him, and yet that on that very same night, last night, he was over there
Mhm.
dabbing it up with the cops and shit. The cops obviously don't give a shit about the pro-Palestinian encampment, especially because 2 nights prior, at this point, when the counter protesters actually entered the or tried to enter the encampment, they came with weapons, they came with fireworks, they came with skunk spray, they came with bear
Is that
mace.
that was like the day that because they were chanting the "Where were you?" Was this the "Where were you" moment?
I don't know what do you mean? Where were you, moment?
Oh, yeah. I guess you were sleeping. Like last night, whenever it happened, like a lot of the protesters were like chanting at the cops,
Oh
and they were
yeah.
saying like, "Where were you?" Yeah, yeah. Okay, so like we're talking about the same thing, right?
So the night prior, the reason why they were chanting "Where were
Yeah.
you" last night to the cops is probably because the night prior, Zionist counter protesters actually stormed the camp and beat the shit out of some of the Palestinian students, like or pro-Palestinian students, with like wood
With two by
pallets.
fours. I watched it happen. I watched it happen live. It was disgusting. Like I was kind of disappointed that the police didn't arrest any of
Yeah,
them.
the
And then the
police
police
came.
finally got
The police
here and they
actually
stopped.
came.
They did.
Yeah, and they stood by for an hour and 30 minutes in single file line formation
Yeah.
while these guys were beating the shit out of, and these guys aren't even students. Like you can see it in the video. They're like, these guys are like adults. They're older. You know what I mean? They're
Well, I mean,
like
to be
older than the
fair,
students too.
there's also the protesters that are Palestinians that were identified as being older as well.
Yeah,
So
yeah. No,
it's hard to
I know.
really
I'm
know who
saying
is and yeah.
no. I'm saying that like a lot of these guys, especially the more violent ones, have already
Yeah.
been like identified as not going to UCLA, and they're
Oh yeah. I
basically
mean,
return
I hope so.
customers. And they're basically return customers at this point. It was a big point of contention with the students too,
Yeah.
because UCLA was like, "Oh, we are going to take administrative action against the counter protesters for being violent." And the students were frustrated with that because they were like, "How the fuck are you going to do anything as an administration to someone who's not a student?" Because a lot of the counter protesters were not students. Like there were
Right.
known right wing figures and stuff like that amongst the counter protesters. Anyway, so the reason why the students were frustrated, understandably, is because they've demonstrated great messaging discipline so far. They are very they're as limited in their disruption as possible. And historically speaking, campus-wide protests such as this one is infinitely more disruptive than what the pro-Palestinian encampment looked like. I mean, we're talking in 1968, they were taking fucking literally students would go in during the civil rights movement with guns and take deans hostage. In
Oh
1968 in
yeah. They
Colombia,
like
they
burned
took a
all
dean
the
hostage for
windows
like
and-
days.
Yeah. Yeah, I know about that.
Yeah, they would literally just like shut off access for a dean from like leaving their room. They'd be like, "No, you're not leaving." So historically speaking, people on the right side of history that we understand were on the right side of history have taken way more radical and way more disruptive approaches to protest. So all things considered, both in the Columbia University, where they overtook Hamilton Hall again, just like they had done time and time again at Columbia specifically. That hall has a historical significance for student protesters. And also, especially at UCLA, where the encampment was like not even remotely disruptive, simply just taking on this massive lawn space where there's a lot of demonstrations usually, and building like putting tents around it and trying to protect the tents from people coming in and fucking it up. There are
Yeah, yeah,
videos of
no.
counter protesters breaking into the encampment in spite of the human wall, the human shield,
Yeah.
the human chain that they create. And as soon as they get in, they start fucking throwing hooks, throwing bows, stealing people's fucking tents, trying to like shit on, like trying to break the tents apart and stuff. So that's the reason why they don't want to let in random people to protect the students, because they know the university won't do that, as demonstrated by the
Oh
fact
yeah.
that they
Well,
didn't do that when the counter protesters came and the cops literally stood idly by.
I do think that like whenever I watched it live, there was like crazy fucking violence, and then once the cops showed up, even whenever they were in that line, the violence went down by like 95%. But I think that you're totally right that the counter protesters were like the agitators. They 100% were, and they were being violent. And to me, it was disappointing that I think the police didn't arrest more of them because it was pretty obvious that the pro-Palestinian ones were the ones that were the victims in that situation.
Yeah, but they ended up
Um,
arresting only the Palestinian, like the pro-Palestinian side. And
it seemed that way to me.
the night prior, they didn't actually engage with the counter protesters uh,
Yeah.
until until they were setting off fireworks and launching them directly in the encampment. So the question is, why are they picking a side? Because they've arrested hundreds of students, both at
You mean why
Columbia
are the
University,
police
both in
picking a side?
CCNY. What's up?
You mean why are the police picking a side?
Oh, the police are picking a side, and it's not the side that is the violent side in this situation. It's the side that's peacefully demonstrating.
Hmm.
In my opinion, a direct violation of First Amendment rights. I don't
Well,
even personally believe that protesters are supposed to like protests are going to be disruptive. Some of those protest movements you might not agree with, or the taxes you might not agree with. But ultimately, the way I look at it is, um, they were the perfect victims in this situation, even though I don't expect them to be perfect victims. And yet, even after all of that, they were still met with violent suppression, violent free speech suppression from the state.
I don't know if it's really free speech suppression, right? Because they're not really getting arrested for protesting. They're getting arrested for putting a bunch of tents on the campus whenever the campus tells them to leave.
Yeah,
I mean, the police can
nobody
come
nobody
in
ever
and
get
arrest them
nobody ever gets
for
arrested for protesting. That's just that's not a thing.
well, that's what I'm saying.
Everybody always when states like like in Russia or in China or whatever, when people are like getting arrested for protesting, the state, of course, makes up like another reason for it there as well. They'll be like, oh, trespassing. You know what I mean? Obstructing.
But do you think that's unreasonable?
Um, do I think that arresting someone for protesting peacefully is unreasonable? Yes.
Well, do I think that, I mean, I think a better question is that if you own a property, like, should you have the autonomy to decide who's on that property?
Well, in this circumstance, it's literally public property because it's UCLA. UCLA is a public school too, so that ultimately that ultimately changes the dynamic a lot. It depends on what the property is, though. There's like private property,
Yeah.
like someone's house, right? I don't think that people should come to your house and protest it at your house. Like that's a is very different, like disrupting your life, and violating your privacy and safety versus protesting in the middle of a public space at the school that you pay tuition to is perfectly valid in my opinion.
Well, everybody else pays tuition too. I think it's kind of unfair if, for
Yeah.
example, some people that pay tuition are locking other people out that are also paying tuition from the same
Well,
services that they're both paying for.
so that's it. You bring up a good point, right? Like you're saying this person also pays tuition. He should be able to go to any space he wants to, any place he wants to on campus, which is
Yeah,
correct.
I mean, like, I'm sure
Except that
there's a few exceptions, but yeah, generally.
yeah, so obviously there are many exceptions, not just a few. Like UCLA campus is very famous. They shut off certain parts of the campus for filming and stuff like that all the time. The difference here is that this is a broad, open public space that these students were already occupying, and the reason why they're not letting, like, they weren't disrupting class, they weren't stopping people from going to class. The university, as a matter of fact, is the reason why the other buildings that were in the surrounding area were shut down. I talked to the students when I was there, and they stated they wanted to go to the library, for example. It's across the green area is across the way from the library. They shut down the library during midterms so that these guys' lives would be harder, so that they would have a harder time studying. They shut down the Wi-Fi so that students that are on the encampment would not be able to use it, trying to make this protest as hard for them as possible, which is normal. I don't think that that's a good thing to do personally. I think it probably goes against the values that UCLA espouses, specifically ironic because like a lot of these campuses literally have like super woke terminology in their studies. Like USC literally doesn't have genocide studies. They call it resistance to genocide studies.
Oh
So for
boy.
me, so for me, it's like if you're taking that extra initiative to be
Mhm.
extra woke on the aesthetic front, you should probably not be surprised when your students learn the actual lessons that you're teaching in these classes, which is that you should resist the genocide, right? So, the fact that the university turns around after teaching them about many different genocides that have happened all around the world, and then tries to do everything in their power to make it as like annoying for these students as possible is a little hypocritical in my opinion.
It is hypocritical, but it's also something that's driven by the protesters' actions. And the protesters are doing that. And the result of them doing that is the university shutting down those places. And also the university, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about this because I'm not really sure exactly. This is just what I've heard. I thought that about 2 days ago, the UCLA said that the protest was unlawful, but before then, they were basically kind of like not addressing it or not calling in the police to do anything. Is that right?
No, they actually did call the police, but they called the campus police specifically to protect the encampment. I was actually kind of surprised at the university's actions at that time because they knew
Yeah,
that there were a lot of counter protesters that, in comparison to Columbia, for example, which had literally called the police against the encampment in Columbia University,
yeah, I
um,
saw that.
the UCLA campus actually had sent police to line up around with their backs to the encampment. Now, that's not just symbolism; that actually means something, right? When you send
No,
cops,
I
like
think that's
cops.
a. I mean, if the university is allowing it, then really that's the end result. I mean, they're the ones that make that decision. It seems confusing to me that, based off of the logic that like they're trying to shut down the or the library or the Wi-Fi, but they're also like having police come in and protect them. It seems very confusing. Like, what are their goals here? What are they trying to do?
Well, ultimately, their goal is to get the students to shut the fuck up and go away and stop bothering the administration to make these moves about divestment. I
Oh
don't know
yeah,
if you're familiar with the goals of the student protests were, and every campus is different, but like specifically the UCLA one I can speak to.
is the divest. Yeah.
Yeah, is to divest from UCLA. The UC system across the board is a massive endowment, and that endowment basically works like a mutual fund, you know, and they're investing in a lot of corporations, and the students want to have financial transparency in what corporations the university endowments are going to, like what corporations they're investing in, which is perfectly valid, perfectly reasonable demands to make. As a matter of fact, a lot of companies have done this. A lot of people have done this successfully, demanding that people divest from oil and gas companies for like environmental activism. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah,
Um,
it's been going on a lot. And
yeah,
just for the record, like I totally support them protesting against that. Even if I agree or disagree with it, it's their right to protest against that. The only concern that I have is whenever it shuts down other students' ability to learn or get an education or for people to use the facilities in the way that they're intended to.
yeah,
Whenever you talk about the actual like intent of the protesters, I totally support them.
yeah,
Absolutely. Or even the counter protesters, because that's freedom of speech. I think that if you don't have that, I mean, you don't have anything.
yeah.
So,
As
yeah,
long as they're not trying to like directly agitate, disrupt, and like harm the students, because there's also a
yeah,
completely separate dynamic here. You hate doxing, right? Like I
I
assume,
do.
of course.
We all do.
So, would it shock you if I were to tell you that there are active organizations that collaborate sometimes with the Israeli government, sometimes independently, that are tasked with doxing students deliberately and even putting their faces on trucks around the campus and driving those trucks around the campus with their massive fucking uh, billboards, basically saying like this student, their name, and be like this is an anti-Semite.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I would instantly believe that. I mean,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I'm sure that there are people on the other side to do the same thing. It's just simple intimidation.
There aren't any official organizations in
So
the
you're
same way
probably
that
right about
Canary
that.
Mission, in the same way that like the organization I'm referencing is called Canary Mission. There's a couple other official organizations as well. Some of them are American organizations. They literally directly will be like, "Oh, are you at a
Mhm.
pro-Palestinian protest? You're a fucking anti-Semite," and then they plaster their faces. They literally try to stop
Well, you
them
got
from,
that like a week ago, right? Or 2
yeah,
weeks ago?
stopantisemitism.org called
Yeah.
me an anti-Semite of the week.
Yeah,
But I
I
mean, that's
remember.
what's up.
Well, it's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah,
And this is kind of the problem that I have, and I think that really, to me, it's pretty obvious that being against Israel doesn't mean that you hate Jews, right?
of course.
And I
And there
think
are
the
plenty of
conflating
Jews
the
who are
two
against
is
Israel as well, especially at those
absolutely.
protests.
Well, there's even some that are protesting in Israel, as far as I know.
Yeah,
So, yeah, no, I understand that, and I I think that's problematic too. I don't agree with that either. It's, in my opinion, I think it's intimidation, but it's also like a misrepresentation. So yeah, I think that's bad in the same way that anybody else. I also don't think that people who are pushing back against these people, like the actual protesters that are making the encampments and everything like that, I don't think that they're fascists. Like I have people calling me a fascist, for example, which I think is really kind of overboard. And
I
I
mean,
think
I think
also,
some of those guys are
oh, go ahead.
fascists, for the record. I do.
Oh,
I,
oh, oh, and I bet some of the people that are against Israel are anti-Semites. Absolutely.
yeah, but
Yeah, I mean, no, no doubt.
ultimately, no, no, no. I don't disagree with you. I think there's like
Yeah,
there's definitely anti-Semitism in the pro-Palestinian movement as well. But the
yeah,
broader, you have to look at the broadest defense of the movement, right?
right.
Like, what does the movement signify? What their overarching goals are? The reason why I have an easier time calling those who defend Israel fascist is because Zionism is predicated on the idea that Israel has to be a Jewish supremacist ethno state that literally has a certain percentage of Jews inside of Israel. This is a demographic concern unlike any other. Here in the United States of America, if we were to say America has to be a nation that is 75%, Irish,
White
English,
or yeah,
and
whatever. Yeah.
German, white, everyone would understandably go, that's fucking insane. That's just white supremacy. But
Yeah.
Zionism is that exact same principle, is that exact same concept, but for very valid historical reasons, it has been able to shelter itself as a defensive posture, as though it is a defensive ethno state. The valid reasons, of course, being the Holocaust
and within the context of like World War II and
yeah,
like everything that happened. Yeah, so
yeah,
I understand that, and I mean, I'm not really a pro-Israel guy at all, honestly. I don't really give a shit about them. It's not my fight to fight. It's not my
it is
problem.
actually. I mean, listen,
Well,
it is.
I mean, that's a good point. Yeah, no, I know
we
what you're
do
saying.
we do spend a shit ton of tax dollars to defend Israel. We gave $26 billion to Israel just this past week.
I mean, yeah, I think it's a fucking waste of money. It's absolutely a waste of money. I wouldn't want to support that, especially not whenever they're doing things and like bombing these people over in Gaza and shit. Like, of course not. Yeah, why would I want to support that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Which is why I think the protest that these students are engaging in is like not only perfectly valid, but I think their methods are above and beyond. Like there are rarely ever going to be protests where like you have a hard time finding a single person that doesn't say something wrong, or a single person that doesn't get ahead of themselves.
You're totally right. I mean, you can't color an entire like movement based off of like the most like
extreme examples,
extremists or like the most bad actors, right? The same as like I'm sure there are anti-Semites that are Palestinian, pro-Palestinian, but that's not the majority of them.
There are also people who are trying to co-opt. Like there's always like a bunch of charlatans on Twitter who are actually neo-Nazis, like openly, but then they'll be like, oh yeah, how about them Jews? Like they'll try to like sneak in to be like, oh yeah, we love Palestine, right? When in fact you look, a couple tweets down and they're fucking
enemy is my friend. Yeah.
Yeah. So that is actually part of the reason why these student organizers are very careful with who they let into the encampment as well, because they don't want to make sure that they want to make sure that there's no one that is like in support of Palestine or seemingly in support of Palestine that's in there to say like some fuck shit. And they do a very good job with that too. If someone
Nazi shit, and that's smart for them to do.
Yeah, so that's the other reason why they don't let everyone into the encampment.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of understand that, but I think that it's also really determined based off of the university. Like the truth is that the university should have the final say on whether the encampment like that should exist or not. And I think that really if the university is okay with it, then of course the encampment should exist because they're the ones that determine what the rules are there. But I think if the university doesn't want the encampment, I don't think that the students have the right to make an encampment there. I think that's unfair.
I mean, I think that ultimately, especially like protests will always be disruptive, obviously, but if protests are only determined by how lawful they are, you can write a law to make any protest illegal, which Americans kind of have, as a matter of fact. I don't know if it would shock you to find out if I were to tell you that in your state, in Texas, if you want to work for the Texas state, if you want to work for the city, you have to actually sign a law that says you will never engage in boycotting or demanding divestment or demanding sanctions on the state of Israel. Did you know this? That's a direct violation of First Amendment rights. A direct violation.
Well, how did that even happen?
AIPAC wrote the legislation. This was legislation that actually two Jewish prominent members of Congress were very much against, as a matter of fact. Bernie Sanders and Dianne Feinstein have openly criticized this for obvious First Amendment violation boundaries.
Yeah, I've never heard of that before.
Yeah,
like I heard there's like some anti-Semitism bill that was happening today. I haven't read about it yet, but I didn't know there was something that was going on that was already on the books, man. That's crazy.
Yeah. Well, would it shock you to find out that there's actually 35 other states, many of them red states, as a matter of fact, that claim that they care about First Amendment and no restriction on free speech? Ironic, because Texas Governor Greg Abbott actually said that, in Texas college campuses, even outsiders can come to campus and demonstrate to the best of their ability. It was
2021, I think.
2019. He
Oh,
wrote
was it a
a
little bit later or earlier? Yeah.
yeah, he he signed legislation into law which he has personally violated himself by
Mm-hmm.
using the government. So free
Are you talking
speech,
about the recent one?
yeah. So
Yeah.
no matter what happens, like the idea that like um every single protest has to go through like a permits process is obviously I think a little bit ridiculous because like it is there that permit process is there to like genuinely make the state restrict certain kinds of speech and only allow other kinds of speech to exist, which in my opinion is in direct violation of the First Amendment in the way that we understand it.
I can
So
see why you say
people
that.
make laws
And
all the time.
go ahead. Oh yeah, of course they do. And yeah, I see what you're saying. Absolutely. And I think that there's probably a middle ground with that where it's like if people are protesting and there's a tent there, it's okay. It's probably not a really big deal. But I still do think that the university or especially other like private businesses should have every right to tell people not to be there because it's also their private property. Like I think somebody's right to protest is really important, but I think it's also important that somebody has a right to have autonomy over their own property, especially whenever if something happens to somebody there, they could get sued for it too.
Yeah,
So, and I think that that's really kind of what the problem with like a lot of this is that I think that like you and I probably align with a lot of the different like opinions that we have in terms of like Israel or Zionism or anything like that. I just don't really think that these methods are effective. And I think that they alienate a lot more people than they bring in.
I think
Like
if
whenever
the
I saw, go
I think
ahead.
if the student protests were not effective, one,
Yeah.
they would not have actually had multiple universities at this point meet their demands, like in Northwestern and in Brown University, and now, as recently as a couple hours ago, Rutgers University has met the demands of Students for Justice for Palestine, which has led to the peaceful dispersal of the encampments. But beyond that, I think that another testament to the success of these protests is the violent reaction of the state. Because in some ways, like police behaving in this way also
Yeah.
galvanizes a lot of the protesters. As a matter of fact, like this entire conversation started originally quietly at Vanderbilt University, where a couple of fans of mine, as a matter of fact, got suspended from school for doing an encampment. Then students at Columbia University saw that and said, fuck that, that's bullshit. We should divest as well. And then their encampment began
It
after
just kind of
that.
spread from there.
And then they got suppressed by the police. And then their encampment grew. And now this is in almost every single state, with the exception of, I think, like 10 at this point, and also happening globally, as a matter of fact. So, in a way, they were profoundly successful. So
Well,
successful
you
that
know a lot more. You know a lot more about this than I do. So I'm kind of curious. So you're talking about like how Brown University and a lot of these other universities successfully, the students have had their demands met. And so
some
whenever
of
you
them,
say
not
that,
all.
oh, okay. Well, the ones that have, did they ever like have the police remove uh the encampments? Because
No,
like I think if the university is allowing it to happen, then I feel like the protest is totally justified. It's completely fine.
no, there was police presence on all the campuses as well. And the police actually said
Yeah.
that they would be interested in violently dispersing the encampments even at Rutgers University. But the administration looked at the demands and found them to be reasonable. See, the thing is, there's two ways to always deal with conflict management, no matter what. You either
Yeah.
escalate, you either use the violent arm of the state to violently apprehend students, break apart the encampments, use pepper spray, tear gas, and rubber bullets that cops literally shot some of the members of my community in the face with last night,
I mean, to be
and
fair,
that's
whenever I watched, because I watched the whole thing happen, I didn't really see a lot of the police officers shooting people that weren't shooting fire extinguishers at them. Like I'm sorry, but I think if you shoot if you are spraying a fire extinguisher at a police officer, I think they have every right to shoot you with a rubber bullet. You shouldn't be doing that. It's disgusting.
well. I don't know if it would shock you to find out, but rubber bullets are not supposed to be directed directly at protesters. It's supposed to be a less than lethal uh, apprehension method or riot control method. And when they actually do shoot someone in
Are
the face,
fire
they can kill
extinguishers
them.
supposed to be directed at people? Like you're not
No,
supposed
no,
to put
they're
a fire
supposed to.
extinguisher at
Yeah, yeah.
people either.
Against fire extinguishers, what they're supposed to do is shoot it on the ground. These guys were directly aiming it at the faces of students,
I'm
and
not
also
sure if they're that good of a shot.
it wasn't just students that were holding fire extinguishers. It was pretty much anyone and everyone. It was it was basically a kill zone. You can kill people with rubber bullets, by the way. That's why they call it
Oh,
less than
absolutely.
lethal.
Yeah, no, you definitely can, but I'm not going to tell the police officers they're wrong for defending themselves against somebody who's blowing a fire extinguisher at them. I think that's ridiculous.
I
I,
think
I,
that.
I think that they should have every right to defend themselves against that.
Do
Like
you
they
think the
shouldn't be
students?
punching
Do
back.
you think the students have a right to defend themselves?
They weren't being attacked.
Wait,
They weren't being shot.
no. The cops were at that point. The cops were apprehending them. They were
Oh, well,
arresting
of
them
course,
on
yeah,
site.
because they were breaking the law, and the university wanted them off the campus,
Yeah,
and they
but
have every right to ask them to leave the campus. They didn't do it, and of course the cops would have to remove them. Like,
let me
what's
ask you
the
this way:
alternative?
do you think it's a
Okay.
poor? Do you find it to be a just and proportionate response to unarmed students? And many of them, almost all of them, were unarmed, and the ones that had, I guess, fire
Yeah.
extinguishers is few. Um, do you think it's an appropriate response to violently, in full riot gear, violently apprehend and assault students because they're peacefully demonstrating, but the university now has demanded that they disperse? Like,
Well,
what?
I think there's two different categories of that. So, for the students that are not being violent, because a lot of the students were being violent, they were throwing things at the cops, they were spraying fire extinguishers at them. I'm sorry, but that's not a peaceful protest. If you're spraying a fire extinguisher at a police officer, you're not being peaceful. So, if the
Well,
police officers are violent in return, no, I actually think it's totally fine.
no. Well, here's the thing. That's the reason why this is really important, right? Like the reason
Yeah,
why,
yeah,
like, I'm glad I went to the encampment. I'm glad that, like, all this was filmed. It was
yeah.
peaceful until the police came with weapons and with riot gear and uh started apprehending with physical force the students.
Well, of
If you
course it
look at
was.
the visuals from
Yeah.
before the police officers actually came onto campus, it was actually quite peaceful. People are dancing, people are singing, people are eating food and chilling overall. It's actually the university that, and this is what many students are saying as well,
Yeah.
both at Columbia University, even students who might not have agreed with the overall cause of the protests now now feel that the university has left them out and left their and compromised their safety personally by bringing outsiders, specifically cops, to come in and violently apprehend students who weren't doing anything, who weren't
I
harming anyone, who were simply demanding in the most peaceful way they possibly can, like literally, that the university divest from
yeah.
a violent state that they are funding and facilitating.
I get that. I also totally disagree with it. I think the university should have every right to decide who is and isn't on their property. And I think in the instances that you were giving me an example of earlier, like Brown, I think that Brown didn't ask the police to come in and Brown allowed those protests to happen. And I think that's totally fine. But if the university doesn't want those people there, I think that at a certain point, they have every right to have the police come in and remove them. And the truth is that I don't think that the police were overly violent to a lot of those people. I
No,
really don't. I think
I
it
mean
was,
there's a lot of visuals of people like bleeding profusely from the head,
of course there are,
either
but
due to
there's
getting
also
hit in the
visuals.
head, but that's violence, right? Like that's
Well,
I
it's
just
violence because it is like there's no other. So here's an interesting question, right? So like, what would you propose as an alternative to that? Like, how
oh
would you solve it
this is great
instead of having police? Yeah, yeah. Go
great
ahead.
question. So my solution to this would be exactly what Brown and all of these other campuses did, which is to allow the protest to continue and also meet the demands to the best of your ability, and take an honest negotiation effort with the students, because ultimately, if you believe personally that these students are in the right, and it seems like you specifically do think that these students
I
are
think they have
making
every right to
making
protest.
just demands,
Yeah, they are.
right?
They have every right to protest. And
Yeah.
like for example, like at UT here, like we had a lot of protests, and it was very disappointing for me to see a lot of people in my chat and just in the community in general that were celebrating whenever the police were coming in and removing them, because these people were not being violent. They weren't breaking the law. They were just protesting, and I completely support that.
Yeah, but until the university decides that they can't, is what you're saying
Right.
for
Yeah.
UCLA. So
And that's my perspective.
the UT, University of Texas Austin, administration saying like we don't want these protests on campus, uh, leading to a police response would be just then. But you because
I
you're
think in a Oh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No, go, you go ahead.
Yeah. So I think that it really kind of depends on the situation. In general, I think the answer to that is probably yes. But I'm sure that there are probably some circumstances, especially with people that are just there and not taking up space and are just talking and not really like obstructing anyone, not setting up encampments, and they're just there. Yeah, I would think that's really kind of fucked up for them to remove them for that reason. But in the context of what happened at UCLA, I don't think that it was fucked up, because it had been going on for multiple days. And like it doesn't, like, I mean, let's be real, who really gives a fuck about the pavement and everything? But they are graffitiing everything, and they're destroying a lot of things. Like I see windows getting knocked out in
No,
multiple
there
different
were.
places.
I don't think there were any windows knocked out at UCLA. You might be confusing that with Columbia, and the only
Oh, I think
windows
that
that were
you could be
knocked out.
right. That's what I was saying, in multiple places. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay.
No,
So Columbia
sure.
University, they broke into Hamilton Hall to take it over, which is, again, I will defend that as well. I have defended that. I think that's
You think that's
perfectly
a good idea?
valid because
I
like
don't know, man. I think
trespassing. It's
it's say
trespassing,
what?
right?
Yeah,
Uh,
well, it's not just trespassing. It's like breaking, like you're breaking the windows to trespass, right? It's
yeah.
one thing like, oh, we just
So
walked in, but if you
material
break the
damage to
windows to walk
facilities.
on, that's different.
Yeah, material damage to facilities is like is an injustice, is what you're saying here in this situation, which
I think,
you might have that
yeah,
opinion.
it absolutely is. Yeah, it
Yeah.
absolutely
Okay.
is.
So then, don't you think that the university's reaction by sending thousands, using millions of dollars of taxpayer dollars, and sending in thousands of cops to break every door inside of Hamilton Hall and most of the windows outside of Hamilton Hall caused an infinite more amount of material damage than just simply meeting the students halfway at the bargaining table?
I completely agree with it. And the reason why is because it's their property to damage, and they have every right to do that. And the law has to be upheld to a
But
degree. I don't
doesn't that mean that like the university kind of doesn't give a shit about the material harm in that circumstance? Because
Well,
if they
I
cared
think they
about what
give a shit
happens
about
to the
having the
two
autonomy of
windows,
their own. Well, it's not about the material harm necessarily. It's about having the autonomy of the material harm and being able to decide what you do with your own material and what you do with your own property and what you don't do with it. And I think that's extremely important. And it's worth more, and it's more important than any actual material or piece of property in itself. It's the essence that somebody has their own autonomy to decide what they do with what they own.
because
And I
one of
think
the
that's
things
very
that they also did at Columbia was um, falsely claim that like these students were actually harming and being anti-Semitic and like scaring Jewish students, even though ironically Jewish students were overrepresented in those arrested in the
uh-huh.
first sweep. So once again, it's the university that is claiming that police action must be met, like police action must occur upon these students because they have made up a fake reason, a bullshit reason, really, that these students are somehow scaring the student population and threatening them when no
Well, I
such
mean,
evidence
isn't
existed for
that a
that,
secondary
only
reason?
to cause far greater harm to the student population, because then they violently assaulted and arrested hundreds of students. So it's like
Sure, but they
it's a bit of
violently
a I'm
arrested
cutting
them
my
because,
nose to spite my face situation, don't you think?
but it's their face to cut, and it's their
Well, not
decision to make.
really, because it is the
Well, it clearly
students.
is because it's their right, it's their business, and or not business, I guess you could say, but
It
it's
is a
their
business. No,
university.
universities are a business
Uh,
for sure.
Yeah, no, I think that in some cases you're probably right. And I think also like a lot of the people that were being violently arrested, I think it takes two to tango in a lot of cases. And I think a lot of these people are being violently arrested, but they're also not complying with what the police are wanting. They're actively breaking the law. And I don't think that's something like how do you like
So
and,
you
and
bring up
and
a
this is
really
like a
good point.
question like, well, like let me like yeah, how do you deal with a person that is actively resisting you
So
and won't obey the law? Because I
so
feel like you have to restrain them somehow, don't you?
so you actually bring up a really good point that I love this conversation. This is not a gotcha at all. Have you ever been arrested?
No, I have not.
Okay, so I have.
I've been pulled over. I've been like detained, but I've never been arrested.
Yeah, so I have. And this is not. I promise you, it's not a gotcha at all. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because so resisting arrest is what is known as like a tack on charge.
Yeah.
Because cops oftentimes, I'm sure you've seen like body camera footage. Well, they'll be like, "Oh, stop resisting," while they literally have like their knee on the neck of a suspect
Oh
already.
yeah.
You know what I mean? That's on the
It's
ground,
disgusting.
and
Yeah.
it's technically a bullshit charge, and here's why: because getting handcuffed physically, like physical restriction, physical apprehension, is actually done in such a way that your body cannot contort in that way. So your body naturally reacts when your arms are behind your back and you're being
Yeah.
placed in handcuffs. So it's actually one of those laws that is basically designed because it's the physical natural response to you being apprehended. So many times, in many instances, like it's basically there so that it gives cops just cause to say, well, we're using force because you're forcibly resisting. When in fact, many people who are being arrested in a lot of circumstances are not physically, like directly violently trying to resist in the way that you and I would understand it, like, you know, punching a cop or you know what I mean? Like, or like not
Oh yeah.
complying. But in many circumstances, there actually are simply trying to comply. In many body camera footage, we see that too, where they're like, I'm not resisting, I'm not resisting. And they just keep saying, stop resisting. It's because your body is physically moving in that way naturally. It's built, it's designed in a way to just add on to the charges to justify after the fact. Once you have decided to apprehend someone physically.
And you're saying this is what's happening whenever you get handcuffed?
Yeah, 100%.
Well, well, what do you think about
And
like
another
other
charge and another
yeah,
charge that
what do you
they're
think
using in
about other
UCLA.
instances of resisting though? Right?
What,
Because
what,
like, I think that there are a lot of instances where somebody is resisting arrest and it's not because of a body contortion reason. They're running away from police or trying to push them away. I mean, you can't have that. I mean, I'll grant you the handcuff thing, sure. I
so
mean, I think that there are a lot of cases where like cops are unnecessarily violent and they escalate the situation in a way that they shouldn't.
yeah,
And I think that's bad, absolutely. But I
I'll
mean,
give
there
you
are
another
also
perspective that is also even
for sure.
crazier than that. Are you ready for this? It's gonna blow your
Yeah,
fucking mind. In Germany, in Germany, it is
yeah.
technically not illegal to try to escape prison. Did you know this?
No, no, I
Yeah,
didn't know that.
because under the German understanding of human law, they believe that obviously all men want freedom. So it is a perfectly natural and perfectly valid response to being apprehended and being put in prison. So technically, when you do try to escape prison in Germany, if you do actually escape prison in Germany, the only charges they will add on is if you are escaping with the state's clothes. Like if you're wearing prisoner garb, they will say,
Effectively stealing.
yeah, like in America, if you obviously try to escape prison, like that's a charge in and of itself. In Germany, they don't even
Yeah.
have that. They don't consider that to be an additional offense to add on to your record because they consider that to be the natural predisposition of humans that they want to be free. It's just the
Oh,
reason why I brought it
absolutely.
up is because like we a lot of laws are designed around the culture and whatever our material conditions are, whatever we want
Yeah.
the criminal justice system to do. And that is precisely the reason why the application of like things such as trespassing or things such as like lawful dispersal are oftentimes simply charges that we've created so the state can suppress free speech without, saying we are doing this because we don't like what you're saying. But that doesn't change the reality that it's a bullshit charge, a tack on charge, or a charge that they're using specifically to actually violently suppress free speech.
I don't agree with that. I don't, because like there are a lot of instances where they're trying to arrest somebody and the person is actively trying to fight them and stop them from arresting them. Like, how can you have a world where that's acceptable? Like, wouldn't that massively endanger the lives of every single police officer?
It
If
depends
it's
on
acceptable to
it depends
resist
on which
arrest like that?
country we're talking about, I guess. But
Well, like in the US, right? I mean, like, yeah, I mean, whatever Germany does is what they're gonna do. But it's like I can't see a world where being able to resist arrest is like not going to lead to massive risks of violence against police officers.
it's the application of the law. I think that there should be probably a higher standard for things such as this, because obviously, like, um, as long as it's not violent, as long as it's not like
Yeah.
genuinely causing harm to others, I think that a trespass law in this situation, especially because it is public land, trespass in this circumstance is, in my opinion, not meeting the standard of violent state apprehension. If it was something else, if these students were like beating the shit randomly out of like students that are walking around, then, well, you have a specific charge for that, right?
Yeah.
I think that trespass is just a bullshit one to use in this circumstance, especially after the vice chancellor, hours prior to the sweep, actually went and sat down with the students. And
Are
in
you
that
talking about
conversation,
in UCLA?
yeah,
Okay.
and the vice chancellor made it seem as though they were doing this to protect the students. They were claiming that they wanted police presence there to protect the students, and the students kept asking him whether there would be a sweep at all, because police presence in this circumstance would not actually mean safety for the students or security for the students, but the exact opposite. And he basically said, "Oh no, there won't be a sweep, or maybe there will be a sweep, but you'll be able to leave before the sweep." Giving them only one option, which is leave or get beaten up. I don't think that
Well,
that is. I don't think that
I mean, I don't,
that's valid to
but you
do.
think it's, I think it kind of is in a lot of circumstances. And the reason why is because the alternative to that is that you are effectively holding the university hostage. And I
But
don't think that's fair
but they're
either.
not. Wait,
Well,
what do you
they
mean
kind
by
of
that?
are. Whenever they're saying we won't leave until you do what we want, and then you can't make them leave, they are effectively holding the space hostage, are they not?
I mean, the spaces they're occupying is marginal. They could even hold an actual space hostage, I guess, like if they were to go inside of a building and set up
Yeah.
barricades and whatnot. And at which point, what I care about is what their goals are, right? Because all matter of protest is inevitably going to be disruptive. This one wasn't. That's why I think it's like truly unconscionable, the reaction from the university. And that's why there's a lot of students who are very pissed off right now at UCLA who think like this was unacceptable, because these students did not go above and beyond. They didn't do other things like actually block students from going to class. That never actually happened. Or even like block students or block faculty. As a matter of fact, faculty and teachers under UAW 4811, the local UAW for the grad student union and the teachers union there, specifically were participating in the protest against the police presence, thinking that like at least if the teachers are there, the cops will be less likely to beat the shit out of the people, and that still didn't stop them. That's why you see
Yeah, I saw
images
there
of
was that
like
one video
deans.
of like that lady. Yeah.
Yeah, you see images everywhere of like there was a lady who is the head of Jewish studies at one of the universities that literally was physically assaulted by the police. She's a Jewish woman. She's a professor. She's the head of the Jewish cultural studies at the school, and cops are beating the shit out of her for saying that like Israel is doing a genocide. I don't think that any of these. I guess like the thing that annoys me the most about this stuff and the way that it's covered in mainstream media is the
Yeah.
hypocrisy of it all. Beyond the obvious issues, beyond my own personal perspective on the matter, beyond the fact that I think it's truly unconscionable that our tax dollars are going to fund and facilitate ruthless baby slaughter overseas instead of, helping Americans, helping
Homeless
people.
people here, yeah.
Yeah,
No,
helping
I
homeless
agree
people here.
I agree with you on that perspective.
Beyond that fact, the idea that these guys are somehow doing this to combat anti-Semitism is truly ridiculous, especially when in many instances the people that they're beating up are Jewish students and also Jewish members of faculty, in some instances literal Holocaust survivors that go and participate at these protests. So it's all bullshit. Like the reasoning that the media gives is bullshit. The justifications that universities give is ultimately bullshit. They just don't want this kind of protest to occur. They just don't want it at all. They want everyone to shut the fuck up and say that you love Israel unconditionally and that you should make no demands from the university whatsoever.
Well,
And I think
think that the university isn't, at liberty to be held accountable by anybody who wants to get together and hold them accountable, even if it's students. Like I agree with you that like all of these things are bad, but just because something is bad, that doesn't necessarily greenlight any behavior you take in order to hold somebody accountable for it. So like, wow, yeah, I think that it's absolutely fair for the students to want to, protest to make the university divest or, not be involved with those things. Absolutely, that's fair. But whenever you do it in a way that the university doesn't want you to, I think that yes, they have every right to have you removed because that's the way the law works. And I
the
think that's what I would say if it was a Walmart doing this or a Starbucks or a person at their house or anything. Because again, a person should have autonomy and the right to decide what they do with their own space. And
well,
also, it's not like the protesters are speaking for every student. There are a lot of students that probably are, like kind of neutral about the topic or might even disagree
well,
with it.
would it shock you
So,
to find out? And I know that this is like not something that mainstream media covers at all. But for example, student hold votes, like student government body will hold votes for divestment. In Colombia,
sure.
90% of the student body voted in favor of divestment. 90% in Columbia University. So it's actually not about democracy, it's the exact opposite. It is
Well, it's
not
not
meeting
democracy.
the demands of the students or the interests of the students whatsoever. As I'm sure many students, much like yourself, would probably agree that it is kind of ridiculous that we're, participating. Our tuition dollars are going to like baby murder machine, right? And
I do.
for the record, historically, the reason why I brought up like 1968 and many
Sure.
other instances because in 1985 specifically, Columbia University students and students across the board, across the United States of America, originally did the BDS movement and did the exact same things, if not more violent at that time, as a matter of fact, and successfully were able to get their universities to concede to the reasonable demands that they were making, which was to divest from apartheid South Africa. That's the history that these students are relying on, and they're hoping, understandably so, that these institutions that are supposed to be there to educate them will be human and will be
Yeah, no, I get
reasonable.
that. Well, they're trying to get the institutions to come to the table. And my point of view is that I don't think the institutions should be made to come to the table. I think that you should have every right to try to get them to do it. But the idea that you're going to hold spaces hostage or destroy property or do really anything that violates their rights or violates what their autonomy of their own property and what they have control over, that's what I disagree with.
But
I
you
I don't have a
okay.
problem with people being angry about it. And also like anybody can like people don't have to go to that school. They're choosing to go to that school. And the student votes are not the like a university is not a democratic republic. It's not a democracy. So the student votes matter, and I think that
Well,
yeah, they probably
I think it should be. Like,
well,
if
that's
you were to
what
ask
I
them,
mean.
they would say that they are a place for learning where they do care about their students' interests and stuff, and they wouldn't like if
Well,
you were
and
to
so at
ask
this
them,
point,
they would
you're right.
disagree with that statement. I think.
Well, I think that it depends on whether that statement is convenient for them. But
Yeah,
the
no,
truth is
they're
that
hypocritical for
oh,
sure.
absolutely. But it's still their right to be hypocritical. And
Is it?
I'm not, and I think this is like kind of two different conversations, and we could be talking a bit past each other, but I think that really they should have the final say in whether they do this or not do it. But I do agree with you in essence that what they're doing is hypocritical, and I also think that it's bad. I think that they're wrong. I just think that it's important that people have the right to do what they want to do, and they can't be intimidated or bullied into doing what a mob of people tells them to do. I think that's extremely scary, and that's worse than almost anything else.
Wait,
Uh,
really? You would prefer rather that like because the difference between the majority, the tyranny of majority, is the tyranny of minority. So you're saying you prefer the tyranny of minority to the tyranny of majority? Because the
well,
tyranny of majority is
well,
democracy, right?
well, like let's think about this a little bit more logically. So I see what you're saying, and that's an interesting point, but I don't think it really applies here because, for example, if a lot of people are around like some sort of I don't know, grocery store, and there's more people that want to get the food out of the grocery store than the people that work at the grocery store, then you would have a majority of people that you could logically say, based off of democracy, should be able to do that. But the truth is that it's not tyranny of the majority or the minority. It's tyranny of the people who have the rights and the ownership of what they have those rights and ownership to, and their autonomy to decide what they want to do with that. So it's neither.
I'm a little confused by your example because
Okay. Maybe I explained it
in this
badly.
circumstance is like outsiders,
Yeah.
like the example that you're using would actually be best explained with strikes, right? Because
Yeah.
what you're the analog here is actually grocery store workers who participate and work at the grocery store, like clerks and whatnot, who are a part of, let's say, some kind of collective bargaining, some kind of union,
Yeah. Something.
decide that they are generating a shit ton of profits for the Walmart family, the Waltons, right? And they're saying, well,
I
I
mean,
think we
yeah.
want
I know.
what's up?
Oh, I worked at Sam's Club for a week, and in orientation, they even had things on the wall saying how bad unions were.
Oh yeah,
I know. Yeah,
yeah. I love Sam's Club.
it's a
Costco's
great
probably
place.
better. Costco's a little bit better for their workers, but I was in awe of Sam's Club when I first came to America. I thought this is the greatest thing America's ever invented.
Sam's Club has better pizza, man. It's really good.
But yeah, um, but the thing is, in that circumstance, right, the majority of
Yeah.
workers at Sam's Club would potentially stop, or Walmart would potentially stop people from going into Walmart, which has historically been done, for not just Walmart, but like it's been done time and time again. And these examples of protest are disruptive at the time and possibly even very annoying for those who just want to get their fucking food and get the fuck out and they don't
Yeah.
want to think about it. But ultimately, movements like this have created a lot of the rules and a lot of the freedoms that we now take for granted, including things like the weekend, including the abolition of child labor, even though it's coming back to America, to many different states right now.
In
Um,
Roblox.
workplace protections, things of that nature. So the reason why I am on board with these students is not because they're like doing unimaginably peaceful protests, like much better in a much better way than I would ever
Well,
be able to do it.
you're using an argument of basically the ends justify the means,
Yeah,
right? Is that?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, you are, and I
But only
understand that.
because like the ultimate
Yeah,
goal is one that I agree with and I think is just, and I think you think is just as well.
and that's what I think is scary, though, right? Because once you create a foundation where that type of thinking is justified, then who's to stop people who disagree with you and want to do something bad for thinking and applying the same type of logic? And that's what I think is scary because I think you're
But that
right,
already
right? I mean,
exists.
like,
That is
God,
how
it
most people
does, and
approach
it's
matters.
bad. It's also very bad, right? And what I'm saying is that I think there's a situation where in applications of the law, all of it is bad or none of it is bad. You can't have a thing where you kind of means test each individual person and each individual cause as to whether or not it's justifiably okay to break the law for this cause. I think that's very unfair, and
That
I
that's
think also depends
that's
on the
not
people
true
being
though.
asked.
What you're saying is actually not correct. I just
How
want
do
to
you
let you
feel?
know. That's precisely the reason why the prosecutor's office in Texas, in Austin specifically, refused to prosecute all of the individuals that were apprehended by the Texas state troopers
Oh yeah, yeah, I read about
at the
that too.
protest. So like leniency is exactly how the criminal justice system applies the means testing, I guess. And the reason for why they did that is because these guys were lawfully protesting and exercising their First Amendment
Well, they
rights.
weren't doing well, yeah, they weren't doing anything wrong. Number
Yeah,
one, like the people here at UT were doing nothing wrong. They should have never been apprehended.
yeah,
There's no
but the
reason for them
same
to be apprehended.
fate will befall the UCLA students as well. And the reason for why they will inevitably not get any serious criminal charges or any charges whatsoever is because ultimately what they are doing is peaceful demonstration. The major purpose here of sending the police there is not actually to this is what is like on principle alone anti-American, in my opinion, if we are to believe the First Amendment is real and
Sure,
true and
yeah.
enshrined and protected by the Constitution, which is probably one of my favorite things about America, considering that I came from Turkey, and a lot of the shit that I say about the American government or even the Turkish
Yeah, you
government,
can
as a
see that
matter of
over
fact,
there.
would lead me
Yeah.
in serious criminal punishment in Turkey, my
I am
nation of
glad to be
origin.
here. Yeah,
So
no,
yeah,
I totally agree with you there.
so that's why when I see stuff like this, when I see the state acting in this way, when I see the state like designing new bills that say like criticism of Israel is inherently anti-Semitic and should be
That's
illegal,
the one from today.
yeah, when I see stuff like
Yeah,
that, I
yeah.
am genuinely much more fearful
That's
about the
terrifying.
future.
It's awful.
Yeah,
It's
much
so
more
bad.
fearful about the
Yeah.
future than like students actually protesting against their
Well,
school in the
I
most peaceful ways possible.
to be fair, I totally agree with you there. But I think maybe the difference is that I view these like in this circumstance, those two examples are both on the spectrum of not good or bad things. But you're absolutely right that the Israel thing, where you can't criticize Israel or say that people are working for Israel, it's fucking ridiculous. Like it's astonishing to me that it's even considered.
So the question I guess is how do
Yeah.
we resist against that, right? And I think the
Well,
reason why the founding fathers enshrined the First Amendment in the Constitution was specifically because there should be healthy dissent against the government in order to stop the government from being tyrannical, from behaving in a tyrannical way, which is
yeah.
precisely the reason why I think that the UCLA students are totally in the right, and the university, instead of taking them seriously and trying to mediate the situation in the same way that other colleges have, seeking the rabid dogs of the state that fucking take that cost LA taxpayers
It's
two to
probably
eight
$10
million
million.
dollars,
Yeah.
$2 to $8 million a day. When let me tell you, okay, if you get your fucking shit stolen out here, they're gonna be like, lol, okay, write a report, okay, and give it to your fucking insurance. It is
Sure.
it's the entitlement and the lack of interest in actually doing your job that really frustrates me about especially Los Angeles Police Department. You and I both know two different people that have had their car stolen that the
Oh,
police did nothing
Jesus
about.
Christ.
Both
Yes.
Ludwig and Myth
Yeah.
got their car stolen, and in both cases, the LAPD said, "Lol, sorry."
Yeah.
But then they have the capacity to fucking send thousands of Los Angeles Sheriff Department dudes rocking like tactical gear, riot gear to beat the shit out of like otherwise peaceful protesters that are 18 years old. These are like queer anthropology students that are sitting in a fucking protest. They're a bunch of hippies, and they're getting brutally taken down by like 45-year-old dickheads from not even from here, from like one of these like edge cities that they all live in together, and coming to brutalize them. I think this is unjustifiable. I think that that is a gross misuse of funds. And as a taxpayer who pays uh, European level taxes, if not more, I wish that, you know, I demand more from I demand more of a return from the taxes that I pay for, and I think it's, you know, my honest American right to do so, just like
Well,
it's
I
the
think
right for these
it's
students to protest.
well, I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. You can demand that as much as you want, but it doesn't mean you can go somewhere and just post up there and expect for people to just have to be okay with it. Like,
No,
I agree with you that the cops are probably like, there are a lot of cases where the cops are incompetent, but like the dichotomy that you're creating between, like, the uh, police officers arresting the protesters and not getting the people who stole Myth or Ludwig's car, like, in my opinion, I think they should do both, because if you don't have law and you don't have rule of law and you can't apply the law, then everything is chaos and everybody is making up their own rules constantly.
well,
And
for
I
me,
can't,
I think the
yeah.
police were behaving in an unlawful way by going in to a otherwise peaceful encampment and you know, beating people and apprehending them. That's what I'm saying. I think it's a violation of the First Amendment to do
I
so.
think that it's, well, like, you don't view it as, like, for example, like if somebody went onto your property, and I understand this is a public university, so it's different, but I
Yeah.
do believe that going on to somebody's property and refusing to leave is violent. It is fundamentally violent. Like, you're not allowing somebody to access or to use part of their property that they own.
Yeah, but
Like, that
this
is,
being
I
different is
feel like,
important though, because there's a difference between personal property like your house or whatever versus
sure.
public property of a school that you are actually paying tuition to utilize the grounds on. Like there, it's entirely different. That's why there's public spaces to begin with, so that people can protest in places like that, in parks and whatnot. So I guess the question I had for you
Yeah.
at this point is like 1968 Vietnam War and civil rights protests are happening. They're much more violent ultimately than these this round of protests that are occurring in college campuses. Like, you at the end of the day agree with the ultimate solutions that occurred, right? Like ending the Vietnam War,
Well, that's really
and
the thing, right? Is that so, like, I can see where you're going, and you can, like, kind of like redirect if it's not, but like, basically my perspective is that I do agree with you on doing those things, but I think that if you use the argumentation of the ends justify the means, I think that can be used in a lot of ways that are extremely harmful, and I think that also they can always be used in very hypocritical ways, where the ends justify the means in things that I agree with, or you agree with, or somebody else agrees with, but not in cases where other people don't agree with it. And that's why I think that the only way to have any sort of a stable society is to have an official set of rules that everybody has to go off of. And if you start going off of that, or, like, diverging from that, everything becomes chaos and everybody starts inventing their own rules. And you have situations like what's been happening. And I think it's worse for everybody. Like you said, it's millions of dollars that it gets costs. And I think the truth is that if you want to change things, there is a democratic process to change things. And with the university, people do have freedom
but
of
you did say that
association.
the democratic process cannot is not going to work either in the state, in the case of Colombia,
Well,
right?
well, that's because it's not a democracy. But people can deal with it in a way that is democratic, which is simply choosing not to go there. So if people don't like what Colombia is doing, they can choose not to go to Colombia. So I don't really see the problem here. Why does Colombia have to, you know,
Well,
agree with these people or bow down to them if these people don't even need to be there?
so that's a great question. And the best answer perhaps comes from James Baldwin, American writer and civil rights activist, who once famously said, and I don't want to paraphrase this, so I'm going to give you the actual
Sure.
quote here. He said, "I love America more than any other country in the world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." This is the exact same answer that I give to people as well whenever they tell me, "Why don't you fucking leave America if you're such a goddamn hater of America?" Now, the reason why I have the
Well, this
financial
is
freedom,
effectively
I
Well,
have
this
the
is effectively the same quote as, like, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. So I agree with you. I think so, but I don't think all types of criticism are the same. So yeah, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Well, no, what I was trying to point to here with this quote is that I think that you and I both agree that dissent is healthy, right? And
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that there are, as I've explained earlier, um, all throughout history, we have had people who believe that their cause is righteous and their cause is just, and that their means actually, their ends justify their means, right? Their methods of
Yeah.
protest. And that is, I'm thankful, I guess, for people of the past for demonstrating the courage against the state apparatus that violently chooses to suppress them, so that I can live in a country where, or I can live in a world where people have shown that courage time and time again to to bring to bring us all of the amenities and all the freedoms that we now take for granted, whether it
It's a
be,
great place to be.
yeah,
Yeah.
whether it be the American Revolution early on, which was a bourgeois revolution altogether, and there's still a lot of faults in America, but America shows a lot of promise, which it fails to meet on a regular basis. But ultimately, I choose to live here, right? And it
Oh,
is
I
because
love America. I think America's
yeah,
great. Yeah, I
it is
totally agree with
because
you. And well,
what I
you're
was
going
trying
to
to say,
say probably the same thing, right? Is you're going to say because you care about it so much, that's why you're so critical and that's why you're so hostile about
yeah,
things that you don't believe in. Yeah, I totally agree with you.
yeah,
Yeah,
which is why I
I'm
think
completely on the same
it's
page.
which is why I think it's wrong that the state acted in the way that it did in this circumstance. And not only is it wrong, but I also think it's hypocritical that they acted this way. This doesn't mean that, like, for example, in a hypothetical, like if a school
Yeah,
shooter is fucking barricading himself into a school and holding a bunch of children hostage, that, like,
right. This
I
isn't
don't expect the
entrapment the same
state to be
way. Yeah,
violent. You know what I mean? Of course,
yeah, yeah.
I expect them to not do what they did at Uvalde. I expect them to do
Fuck,
to be as militant as they are against, like, a blue-haired queer English major
SJW.
at
Yeah,
UCLA.
right.
Um, except they don't do that. But that's besides the point. That's not. There's a whole different.
Yeah,
That
and
opens up
I
a whole
agree with
different
you.
litany of
I
problems.
think that it's,
So I'm
yeah,
simply stating that in order for the state to react this way, I think um, there needs to be a bar. There needs to be a bar. There needs to be a standard, in my opinion, and that standard was certainly not met in this circumstance.
so like, what do
And
you
it's
think
not
that
just
standard?
because the ends justify the means, but that does
Yeah,
play a role in it, because I do think that they're, like, I'm going to be intellectually honest and not act like I'm taking no stances here. I do agree with this cause. I do agree with the cause of the students. But beyond that, I think that overall were their methods overall were of a peaceful nature, and I think that the school reacting in this way by sending in the cops to brutally arrest these kids was genuinely fucked up, like
well,
really
where do you
really
think that
fucked up,
bar is then? Where do you
and
think that bar is?
and scary as well. What do I think
Yeah,
that bar is? I think, like,
yeah.
I think when you do actually engage in direct acts of violence, probably it makes your cause definitely a lot less palatable to many
And
others.
you don't view like blocking access or trespassing as a direct act of violence.
No, I mean,
Okay.
definitionally, under the legal code, trespass is not considered a violent act.
Oh yeah, no, it's not.
Yeah, I don't know, I don't agree that, like,
I
I don't
think
think that it should
blocking
be considered
access
that.
I think blocking access in some cases can be, however.
Yes, if you're like
Yeah,
technically kidnapping someone, if you're, like,
sure.
restricting their movement, then yes, you are doing that. But these students weren't doing that. The way I see it is, like, everyone dances around the rules, right? Like, to the best of their ability, which is precisely the reason why, like, I guess it's like what these guys were doing is, in some ways, even though their cause is just, and I agree with their methods, and I probably would defend them if they were way worse than they are currently for that reason. I'm being
Sure.
very honest here. Um, in this circumstance, especially, the students setting up an encampment and not allowing, like, random people who are, like, very obviously there to agitate, with the exception of, like, students that are genuinely, honestly, and earnestly trying to lend their support, was for good reason, so that they don't have, like, random fucking Nazis showing up at their doorstep and saying a whole bunch of, like, fucked up things that would put a lot of the Jewish students there in direct danger as well. To be like, oh yeah, free Palestine, also fuck the Jews, you know, that kind of thing. Not only looks bad optically, but it also is not only looks bad optically, but is also putting the Jewish students at that encampment in harm's way. So I think that I guess the comparison is kind of like if there was a family on that courtyard having a picnic, right? Just because
Yeah.
you're a student, you would not that would not give you the right to like step on the picnic while they're having a meal as a family.
Well, let's use the picnic analogy, right? And like, so if the picnic lasts for 6 days, do you think the university should have a right to tell the picnic people to leave?
I don't think the
I
picnic
feel
would
like
last for because at that point it would be
but
something
like
different than a
assume that
picnic.
right? I mean, at a certain point, like I do think that they do have the right to get rid of them. Like I agree with you, right?
Well, here's
I
what
see what you're
I don't
saying,
think the
but I think
university.
there's a limit.
No, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The difference is there have been demonstrations such as that in times past in many other college campuses, and more often than not, they just kind of wait it out and have people leave, or they're like, "All right, what the fuck is going on?" And they could have UCLA could have reacted in the same exact way that other colleges have reacted, like I mentioned, and tried to find a amicable and peaceful solution instead of actually greatly escalating to violent means by utilizing the police force and greatly putting students in danger of physical violence.
Well, I think the
That's
students
my
put
main anger
themselves.
here.
I get that. I think the students put themselves in danger. They were told by the cops to leave and they didn't do it. It's not their property. They weren't allowed to be on there. They were told to leave. They didn't leave. They are putting themselves in that position by their actions. Like, I
I,
mean, these aren't children, right? These are adults and they're smart people that are going to this college in a lot of the circumstances. They know exactly what the ramifications of their actions are.
yeah,
So to say that
that's
like
why this protest is that's what they're doing is brave in some in many different ways because
it
of
is, it
the
is,
potential
even
for
if you
state
disagree with it, it is
suppression.
brave.
Okay, so I guess the question, like I said, with
Yeah.
1968 and whatnot, is that like I don't think you would like as far as all the protests that have happened in the past, like the 1985 anti-apartheid protests,
Yeah.
similar counters were similar counter perspectives were brought up in this circumstance in each of these individual cases. I've also maintained that, or I have also shown, I think, with enough historical precedence that like the government doesn't simply offer people nice things because of the kindness of their hearts. People have to demand those nice things.
Well, you have
And
to vote for them, really.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, that too for sure. But sometimes it goes beyond voting because sometimes the state will refuse what you voted for democratically and will say
Yeah.
no, we're not going to do it. So I guess the question is always like what is to be done, like what are people supposed to do, because there is
I
this
think,
idea, I think it was
yeah.
JFK who said it, that like a violent retaliation to uh what is it? It's like I think
People who make a
violent
nonviolent
suppression of peaceful action makes
makes
violent
violent
retaliation a
action
necessity.
or something. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're saying the same thing. Like I know what you're talking about, and so yeah, I feel like you're definitely right, and that nonviolent action I think should be not going to that university. Don't go there. Vote for things that and vote for people that will represent your interests in a way that's authentic and will enable you to change policy in a way that you think reflects what your views are.
Okay.
I totally agree with that, and that's what I think needs to happen much more, because I think that a lot of people in the U.S. and I hear this sentiment a lot, and I find it to be very. Well, the thing is, it's sad, but it's also kind of true. In some cases, is that people feel like voting doesn't work, and like voting does work, but it should work a lot more than it does. And I think that people are just so demoralized and they're so fixated around trying to like protest or like force UCLA to do something that they lose track of what they really the power that people they really have is voting. We can hold people accountable. You can push for third parties. You can do that if there's enough people that believe in it. And I wish that that energy and
I don't think it's that easy. I think the American
Like,
electoral system it makes that virtually impossible for the most
what's
part.
the other? What is the alternative?
I think the alternative is making through pressure, through public
Yeah.
pressure, by way of like causing some level of material harm in the form of strikes and labor militancy, as we have done historically in the past, is to organize on the boundaries of community, organize on the boundaries of labor, and make demands from at least one side of the political duopoly that they cannot ignore. And that is at the heart of protest movements like this. That's why I am fully in support of protest movements like this, because the reality of the matter is active lobbying efforts from corporations and the very powerful, very wealthy individuals in this society have rendered American democracy useless. There are so many instances where there's like tremendous injustices that are occurring all around us that virtually every American would probably agree on, that that seemingly get no solutions from our elected representatives. The system is designed
Well,
as
that's
it
kind of what I
stands
was talking
currently.
about.
Yeah, but that's why I'm
But
saying like it's not just about it. It can't be just about democracy, because that's the expectation, or rather, shouldn't say it can't be just about democracy. This is about more democracy, right? To
yeah,
make your elected representatives represent your interests rather than the interests of the wealthy few. And in order to get there, you do actually have to take it to the streets sometimes. You do actually have to show them that, like, no, you can't fucking do this. Like, this is ridiculous. And
well, I think it's also about controlling a message and sending a message out that people believe in. Like, you can look at somebody like Bernie Sanders, right? You were a big supporter of Bernie Sanders. I also like
mhm.
Bernie Sanders. Like, the amount of money that he was getting versus, a lot of the people that he was going against was like nothing compared to them. But at the
No,
same
that I
time,
mean, he got a lot of money from individual donors, especially. Um,
I mean, compared to the bigger candidates, I mean, I don't know, like with those massive fucking super PACs,
Yeah, of course. I mean,
like,
it's
yeah,
always
but
going to
that's what I'm
be
saying. Like,
billionaires
it's
are
like,
much easily billionaires are going to much have a much easier time, dumping a $100 million of super PAC than like 100 million Americans giving $1. So
giving
yeah,
a dollar, yeah, of course.
yeah,
Well, that's what
grassroots
I'm
is
saying,
always
right?
much
And so
harder.
I think the strength of the message is something that also is important. And I think if there's a strong enough message, people will believe in it and people will push it. I mean, we're the same age, right? So like you remember Obama, right? I mean, that was a very strong message and people believed in that and they acted on it. And I think that it'll happen again too whenever
Yeah, but
people remember.
Obama was ultimately
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But
Obama ran on
people didn't think
ending
that.
closing Guantanamo Bay, and like
Yeah.
ran against the Iraq War, and then was responsible for the troop surge and like the continuation of the Iraq War, right? So like and
Promise
the
can change his mind. I understand.
so my point is like what do you do when your elected representatives that you voted for have told you a lie,
Well,
right?
like this is the thing, right? Because like people use, for example, like you use the Revolutionary War or like the Boston Tea Party or something like that as an example of like justified violent like basically protest. And I agree with you. And so I think the question is that I think violent and like you know, material destruction protest, like basically illegal protest, is completely justifiable if you're not able to like vent your frustrations democratically. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think the question is really depending on, do people have the opportunity to vent those frustrations democratically? Because like what you're saying is like,
Well,
I
do
think
you
it
think
is
they have do
true.
you think they have this in this particular matter in America? Because you said like,
Well,
why don't
well, there's two circumstances, right? You're talking about with the schools. I think that they don't have it, and I think that they don't have the right to have it because it's not democratic fundamentally. Not everything needs to be democratic. And if you own something, it's like if five people outside your house democratically vote that, your house should be, everybody's house, that doesn't necessarily mean that you lose your house.
well, I mean,
But I'm
if they
talking
paid
about in
for
terms
it,
of the government.
if they paid for my house, then I think it's a whole different conversation. If they didn't
It's
pay
a
for my
different
house,
conversation, but it doesn't mean that it's a democracy.
no, I'm saying that if they paid for my house, that they would have a righteous say, they would have an understandable say in like uh in a circumstance where like they're living in the house and they paid for the house and they're
Yeah.
basically renting, then yeah, no, they do have a right, in my opinion, both morally and in some instances legally, in what happens in the house. That's why if your landlord refuses to fix your fucking mold, for example, you do have a right. Many people don't know this, but you literally do have a right to deny them payment even. So I mean, it's state by
Yeah, no,
state.
it definitely has to go both ways. But what I'm saying is that you can't do everything by tyranny of the majority. And I think that also, whenever you're talking about private property, people should have the right to decide what is and what isn't like private property. And I don't think that people who own private property should, be at the mercy of the majority in a lot of cases.
No, that's
And I
why. I
think,
mean, well, that's why this is public property. Like university campuses, especially state universities, are public property. That's actually quite literally the reason why, for example, those Westboro Baptist Church freaks that go to like all the
oh
college
yeah,
campuses and like talk about how like yell at students and call them the F slur and stuff like that.
oh yeah,
Like those guys oftentimes cannot be kicked out of college campuses for this specific reason, because technically it is public property that their tax dollars are paying for, which makes the situation all the more complicated and all the more egregious in terms of a violation
well,
of
like,
First Amendment rights.
yeah, I think that it's really about the encampment in that case, right? Because the people that were there were really getting kicked out. They weren't really getting kicked out for protesting. They were getting kicked out for having an encampment there.
Well,
So
no,
if
they
the
were getting kicked
Westboro
out for
Baptist,
protesting. They were getting kicked out for
yeah,
protesting. They just used trespassing, even though originally they didn't have an issue with it. Here's what makes it even worse. Originally they didn't have an issue with it, right?
yeah,
And then the counter protesters showed up first day, second day. Third day, the counter protesters showed up in incredibly violent ways, right? And you saw that, you recognized it as well.
yeah,
Then
it was
the
obvious.
school cynically, yes, the school cynically turned around and said, well, this is now a safety issue. So what do you think, what kind of lesson do you think that teaches everyone around the country, that if you want these students to shut the fuck up, if you're if you're like a 45-year-old Zionist dude who just wants to unconditionally dick ride Israel into oblivion, go and beat the shit out of some students, and inevitably the school will turn around and use your violent actions against them to basically say, now the state has to come in and pack up these students themselves. So they first got beaten by the Zionist counter protesters, many of which have been identified and are not from the school at all. Then on top of that, the school used that instance to directly pack you up. Like they're because there's a reason. You can't just declare something unlawful. Like that's not how this works, right? Because like vice chancellors are voted on democratically oftentimes by the student body. And the administration at least like has to maintain a semblance of democracy, especially because it's a woke elite learning institution, right?
Oh, well, I mean, like, just to make one thing clear, like, if these people weren't at, there was no encampment there and they were just sitting there protesting, I think that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that.
So
But
you
like,
wouldn't
you
have an
can't
issue if
just,
they were just sitting there protesting, but because they built a camp to protest continuously, that it demands violent retaliation from the force. Like it justifies violent retaliation from the state.
uh, I think so, yeah. I do. Because like they have no right to do that. They have no right to just start building and putting up tents there. That's
Well, they weren't.
insane.
I mean, they were engaging in continued
And
protest.
also, like, well, also keep in mind that whenever I'm talking about, you're saying engaging in violent actions, like the police told them to leave. The university said that they wanted them to leave. So, like, really, violence was the only thing that was left. And so it's like, does somebody have the right, again, and this is what I was saying initially, does somebody have the right to defend their property? And I think
Well,
the answer is to
but
that is
it's
absolutely.
not their
And that's
property.
what,
It's property that the students are paying for, and it's the state property too. So it's like taxpayers, but
well,
which is why
it's the property that all of the students are paying for, not just the ones that are
yeah,
protesting.
but yeah, but like in the case of Columbia, it is private property, and yet the students. I don't know what the UCLA student votes would look like. I'm not
Yeah.
familiar, but I'm fairly certain, given that 81% of the 18 to 35-year-old demographic in the United States of America abhor Joe Biden's handling of the Israel-Palestine situation, it's not beyond the pale to assume that like a majority of students would probably vote for divestment in UCLA campus as well. So, I mean, I don't know. They might have even held a vote. I'm unfamiliar, but ultimately, they if we're talking about the majority of students or the minority of students, like in this circumstance, like it's still the difference between tyranny of majority is I guess the opposite side of that is tyranny of minority. So it would be like capitulating to the wishes of a smaller percentage of the student base to technically beat the shit out of thousands of students that are protesting on behalf of the majority opinion.
Yeah, but it's also not a democracy. Just because they have a student government or a student body that votes on things, it doesn't mean that the administration has to listen to what the student body votes on.
So
that was never part of it.
Yeah, that's I guess that's the difference in opinion that you and I hold. I do think that they should listen to the student body in this circumstance. And I'm glad that they did in previous instances, like during the civil rights movement, when students took similar actions during the Vietnam War and in the civil rights protests, where we've seen the worst of the worst, like what actually happens when there is resistance, like in Kent State, where they literally shot and killed 4 students. Yeah, they shot and killed 4 students because they did not want they didn't want this fuck shit to continue. You know, they were like, all right, shut the fuck up, you're done. And I find that to be significantly scarier than a university, especially a state-funded university, listening to the very reasonable demands being made by their students, especially students who have followed the law almost entirely, all things considered, despite the fact that people were like attacking them relentlessly. And setting up defenses against that is also perfectly just too. Like that's why they had surrounded the encampment with like a
they were
human
getting
chain.
attacked with the plywood, and so it makes sense. Yeah, definitely. And I think those are 2 separate issues, right? So like you're talking about, like I agree with you that the university should do it, but I also think that they shouldn't have to. And with Kent State being shot by those, I mean, those are police officers that shot them.
National
Like I
Guard.
think, well, national, okay, well, either way, right? This is the government that's doing it, right? It's not like there's not some kind of like, campus police force that's, hired privately. And so I think the problem is that whenever you're talking about something like, Columbia University or UCLA, people have the choice and the decision, the autonomy to decide whether they want to go to that school or not. And I think that the fact that they have that right to do that means, and I think that the other counterbalance to that is that it means that the people that are running the university don't always have to listen to the students. And I think that in a lot of cases, like what you're saying actually does make sense. And I think that it probably would have been better if they did divest. But
so here's the thing though, like you're saying like they could just choose to go to another school. Okay.
Yeah.
Most schools are in some way, shape, or form using their endowments to and also using their research to fund and facilitate Israel's apartheid, right? So let's say you transfer from UCLA to UC Berkeley. Okay, well they're doing that too. What are you supposed to do? Well, you set up an encampment. Okay. Well, now the school doesn't want you to set up an encampment. What are you supposed to do? Let's say you leave UC Berkeley, then you go to Stanford. Well, similar situation exists there. It exists in almost every single institution, which is precisely why
there's a lot of cases where that happens, but I don't think that they are obligated to adhere to anybody's demands. They're not obligated to do that.
No one is obligated, which is why like concessions never come without leverage, which is precisely the reason why I think like especially when students are following the letter of the law in their protests, in their protests, I'm fully unconditionally in support of it, especially because there's no other option in this circumstance, no other option beyond like I guess like I said, all forms of peaceful resistance being met with violent ends from the state would then radicalize people to probably take up violent action against the state, as JFK correctly pointed out.
There's no way to solve the problem other than that.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
there isn't.
and I think that's something that's unique to the state, though. Like whenever you're talking about a private company, I don't think that same type of like difference occurs.
Well, I mean, these aren't private companies. These are like
Well, oh,
universities,
sorry, like
especially public
somebody who's
institutions
not the
are.
government. Yeah, excuse me. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that.
No.
I'm talking about like anything that's not the government.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, in this circumstance, I think that it is perfectly reasonable for the universities to listen to the demands. But beyond that, um, I think that this
I
is
think
a
that this
good is a good pressure point. It's a good pressure point that's like immediately in front of you. It's like a local, it's a local vector for organizing. So I think it's really good to continue increasing public pressure and increasing demonstrations in this regard, because ultimately it doesn't seem like the American government is going to respond to the demands being made by the now the broadest majority of the American population in terms of
you mean
our
in
tax
terms
dollars
of like
going to
the
Israel.
like you know. Well, I don't know. Like, I mean, do you have any data on that? I'm actually kind of curious because I was actually wondering about that myself. What do you think that like do you think that people are like more against Israel? Because I feel like there's like an obvious like really big generational divide because I was
Yeah.
talking to my dad about this and like a lot of people that are like his age are like very pro-Israel and a lot of people that are our age and younger especially are more pro-Palestine.
Yeah, no, for sure. Um, I think that the older you get, the more calcified your position on Israel is, because like it's easier to
They're closer to
manipulate.
World War II and yeah, and
Oh,
also like
not
the
even
whole
that. It's more so.
Oh, okay.
It depends on your media diet. If your media diet is less diverse, and the older
Yeah.
you are, the more you like remember a time when there was like, eight
Hmm.
newspapers and fucking 3 TV channels, where that message is like super easy to control. Um, the more you heard like relentless dick riding of Israel from mainstream media, which you of course trusted. Why wouldn't you? Um, that's the major difference between the generational divide, is that like kids can literally see on TikTok and on social media like Palestinians directly advocating for their own interests. They can see people on the Israeli side directly doing atrocities and celebrating them, like the viral TikTok trends and whatnot that pop off in Israel, or IDF guys like stealing people's underwear and stuff
But it's the
inside of
same
Gaza.
with Ukraine, right? I mean, like it's one thing to hear about it, and it's another
Yeah,
thing to literally see it happen.
yeah.
And I think that's
So
a very good thing. That's an amazing thing.
no, I agree, and so I think that's where a lot of this generational divide comes from. That's why, I mean, senators have openly stated that that is the precise reason why they are banning TikTok inevitably, is because they don't like that there is no control over it as far as like as far as being able to like influence TikTok to make certain censorious decisions. Um, and I think that they find that to be a big problem. Um,
I
but
don't. Yeah,
let me
I
see if
mean,
I can find you like the American, like the overall American perspective and how it's shifted over the years on Israel Palestine.
yeah,
Because a lot of these polls are like also very
they're very
biased.
biased, and it's very hard to get any sort of real temperature check on anything. I remember like whenever they got rid of Roe versus Wade, I looked up a bunch of stuff for abortion, and it was like, oh my God, how are you supposed to know what's real? It's very hard to figure out like real information.
Yeah, I mean, like Harvard Harris is like a really bad poll, for example. Like there's certain polls that are like really bad, where they'll add like a shit ton of qualifiers, only show the Palestinian side as not Palestinians in general, but like Hamas, and they have many different ways of like creating the type of outcome that you want to get.
Of course,
I'm
yeah.
trying to give you like the one that
Yeah.
I remember. One of the recent polls that I remember showed that under the age of 35, 81% of Americans are upset with like disapprove of Joe Biden's mishandling of Israel, Palestine.
I
81%.
I would not be surprised. I mean,
Yeah.
I like based off of just like I mean, again, it's a vibe check, right? But like my vibe check of the internet, yeah, absolutely, yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I feel
Different
like that's
polls
a
I've
huge
seen,
problem.
different polls I've seen show like overwhelming majority support from both
Yeah,
independents and Democrats, and even a majority of support from the Republican Party in terms of a ceasefire, for example. which is a
Yeah.
position that the Biden administration has like not budged on, and seemingly claims that they care about and want to bring about, but never really done so.
I
So
think they're just paying it lip service.
absolutely.
That's what it
So
seems like.
there's stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
So my question, I guess, is what is to be done in that situation? Because like I think that democratically speaking, part of the reason why we voted for Joe Biden, myself and many others in my demographic voted for Joe Biden because we saw the horrifying ways in which like the BLM protests were dealt with by the police force. And that was a promise. That was a campaign promise that the Biden administration had made. And now these young Americans are also seeing that very same police resistance in another circumstance where there's like peaceful demonstrations happening. Sometimes it hasn't gotten to like Black Lives Matter point yet. Obviously, it's not as widely attended.
Yeah.
And it hasn't like turned into riots, I guess. In this circumstance, but that is a direct contradiction of like what you voted for, what we all
It
voted
is,
for in this circumstance.
I don't think that you really voted for Joe Biden for that reason, because you, like you voted for him because he was the option that the Democratic Party gave you. Because like I think that you were Bernie Sanders, like you were about that, and
Yeah,
then they
no,
just
that was
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
But
he got fucked.
no, for sure. But my point is that was a part of it. The part of it that was
Yeah,
that he's not Donald Trump, and Donald Trump was the one that was like
exactly.
actively suppressing and saying law and order over and over again when faced with like the Black Lives Matter protest. So that was that was the assessment from many who voted for Joe Biden, thinking that like, well, he would be able to bring about some positive change and maybe tackle some of the issues within policing and discrimination. Now, obviously, that didn't happen. But
No, it didn't.
beyond that, there are many other campaign promises that were violated, including but not limited to dealing with protesters, like talking about journalists getting arrested and whatnot. That was another major point of consideration. There's a video of Biden talking about the George Floyd protest, saying, "We will not allow any president to quiet our voice. We won't let those who see this as an opportunity to sow chaos throw up a smokescreen to distract us from the very real and legitimate grievances at the heart of these protests." Now that he's president, however, he basically reinforced the law and order must happen narrative that Donald Trump was advocating for. So my question always is like, well, what is to be done? How do you and many other Americans get our lawfully elected representatives to
How do we hold them accountable?
follow through on the demands that they originally ran on the promises that they originally made?
I don't know, because I think it's a very complex question, because I'm sure some promises are made and then somebody gets into office and they realize, wait a minute, it's not that simple, it's not that easy. And I think there are probably instances, I'm not saying this is one of them, I think it's actually in fact not, but I think that there are probably instances where campaign promises are made with partial information, and then whenever the person gets more information, they decide not to do it.
Well, I mean, Joe
And
Biden's
it's
been
like
president. Joe Biden was in
he's been
elected
in office. He's
office
been
and
around for
was the
like
vice
15
president.
years, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like, no, I'm not saying this is an example, but I think that there are instances of that, but I don't really know what is the option for that. What do you do? Because like and like this is the question, like what do you think? Because I don't know.
Well, I
Because like what
mean,
do you do? Like a riot? Do you like go and like have a recall? I think at a certain point it's like don't I think a lot of people get tricked into voting for this person, and I don't know how to solve that, because the Democratic and the Republican parties are so big. It's like how do you how do you fight against that? But I think that like you just kind of have to, and I don't know like what alternative you could do that would have any sort of like real meaningful impact.
well, this is one vector of pressure, like protests,
Yeah,
campus-wide protests in general on the streets. It's it's a very good and historically very successful way to get the government to meet your demands, even if it's halfway. So that's why I'm in support of the Palestinian pro-Palestinian encampments that are happening all around campuses all around the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like my perspective is that I support the idea. I support the freedom of speech. I think that at a certain point, whenever you are breaking the law does have to be upheld to a certain extent. But I also think that people's ability to protest should also be upheld. I think that, for example, like camping out somewhere for 6 days and not leaving even after they tell you to leave and the police tell you to leave, I think that's too much. But
Well,
I
they
also
didn't
don't.
even they told them to leave because they said that it was endangering the students
Yeah,
themselves, like in the encampment, saying that and in that circumstance, if they
because
truly
get
cared
attacked
about
or
that, they
something like
could have
that. Yeah.
used the police to protect the encampment rather than
Well,
um
that's clearly not the real reason. Yeah.
yeah, well that's the point. That's what I mean. And if that's not the reason, and that's just simply the seasoning that they're adding on to the conversation, then there's one real reason why they're doing it, and that is because they just want the students to shut the fuck up and go
To
away.
get the fuck out of there. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
And
which I think
I think
is,
it's a bad thing. It definitely is a bad thing, but at the same time, I also think it's a bad thing for a bunch of people to just go camp out at the university for, multiple days at a time. I think that's not unreasonable. I don't think that I'm being unreasonable with this, but I also
I
think
don't
that
think it's
they're
a
being
bad
unreasonable.
thing. I don't think it's a bad thing because
Yeah, no,
there's no other options at that point for people to actually um make a fuss, kind of, you know what I mean, in the most peaceful ways possible. That's precisely what the students are doing because there's no other option there. Do you see what I'm saying? Like there's
well, there
legitimately no
is.
other
You
option,
don't have to
just
go to
like there
this.
was no other
Well,
option
you
in
don't
the
have to go to the school. Like they don't
but
have
then
to
there's
go there.
another school, you go to another school, that school also has the same restrictions, that school also has the
Yeah.
same issues, right? And ultimately you arrive at, like, there's no school that doesn't have this problem. And beyond that, I don't think people should have to leave their schools anyway. I think that the right thing to do in this circumstance is to make demands and to see if enough people get on board with your cause. And if enough people do get on board with your cause, even if there is violent resistance from the police force, ultimately the school should capitulate to the demands that you're making. We have power in numbers, and that's ultimately how democracy does work and should work. But beyond that, laws in this circumstance, as I tried to detail earlier, are just they're used as a legal justification for the actual reason, which you and I both agree on, which is not necessarily um, it's not necessarily the encampments and the space that they
Well, the
occupy, but
campus.
rather what the students are saying.
Oh yeah, I mean the campus has the right to do that though, and I think that if you don't follow the laws, then nobody has any sort of benchmark or frame of reference to how to make any decision. You just have people that are making decisions for, the ends justify the means, and that is, I think, again, chaos. I understand what you're saying, and I think that's fair,
I mean,
and I'm sure it's frustrating, but I also think that at the same time, there should never be a situation where a bunch of people get together and they force a group of people to do something in a way that's non-democratic, because
yeah,
it's really like, because
this was at the
whenever
heart
you
of the
have
civil
those.
rights movement, though. Like Rosa Parks refusing to sit at the back of the bus, um, you know, student protests and sit-ins being enforced in or the Montgomery bus boycott. Like, these are all disruptive acts of civil disobedience that were met with violent police brutality at the end of it. Like, I don't think you have this opinion. You share this opinion on the civil rights movement, I suspect, right?
Well, it's a much different situation. I mean, of course it's different. Yeah,
Why
I
is
mean,
it?
like one of them you're protesting against a government, and the other one you're protesting against a university. A university isn't a government.
Okay. Well, state
I think that
universities.
you're.
Well, they
Well,
did protest against universities as well during the
well,
civil
yeah,
rights movement. So the
sure. What I'm saying is that I think that if you're talking about the actual, what do you call it? If you're talking about actual laws, then yeah, people, if they want to protest, the best way to protest is to fucking vote. Like that's what needs to happen. Like I don't think that you can rely on just getting a bunch of people together and then hopefully the government is going to do what you want. Because also, like, just because there's a lot of people protesting doesn't always mean that that means that that's what the majority of the people want. Because the
The
majority
majority
of
of the
people
people
are
did
not.
not want, you know, the any kind of desegregation in general.
It depends probably on where, but I think that in some cases you're probably right. You know, where they had to like march the,
especially
like
especially in the
black
South. Yeah.
kids and stuff like that. Yeah. Yeah, you're right about that.
So that
And
was
like,
the minority in that circumstance, and allies of the black community demonstrating unlawfully. Like they were breaking the law. They were specifically going to segregated institutions, whether it be universities or whether it be restaurants, private establishments, and demonstrating in a show of force to say that these are unlawful, these are unjust laws that are in place, and these are unjust practices that are in place that are turned that the government turns a blind eye to, and that needs to change. And in that
well, that's again,
instance, just
it's
like
the
these
government.
students, like there were plenty of different mechanisms of the state that, no, it wasn't just the government. I'm saying like private institutions were the ones who are enforcing segregation
Okay.
on their own volition. The reason why we have the reason why we have specific rights that actually interfere in the way that private businesses conduct their affairs on the boundaries of exclusion for certain races
For
and even
discrimination.
gender
Yeah.
discrimination is specifically because, and this was the segregationist argument at the time, which was just let the businesses do whatever they want. I'm sure that people will take their dollars elsewhere, but it didn't work that way. Plenty of people actually genuinely loved the idea that there were white only institutions. White people had more capital than black people, especially in the South. And therefore, all of these businesses, if it wasn't for the federal government, inevitably due to a tremendous amount of protest and a tremendous amount of resistance and a lot of state violence that tried to squash this democratic resistance. If it wasn't for all of that, then we would still not have any laws that interfere in the affairs of private businesses and and uh, and refuse them to
No,
refuse
I
to
see
allow
what
them
you're
to
saying.
discriminate.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying, definitely. I think if you're talking about the protests that are happening now, I do think that is different than the civil rights movement. It's certainly different. And whenever you're talking about the civil rights movement, also, like, I don't know if we can really apply something that happened 60 years ago to something that's happening right now or 50 years ago. It's very hard for me to say. I think in some cases you're probably right. In some cases, maybe not so
What
much.
do you mean by it's different?
It's different because the entire culture is different. The way that people are making decisions is different. The way that people can vote is different. There are all of these ways that are different.
I mean,
So,
yeah, black people were not, they couldn't really vote. I mean, I guess it's not that different now because there's many different ways of legally restricting black people from voting. But that's more complex. But ultimately, the methods were unlawful. The point I was trying to arrive at here is that the methods were unlawful. They were seen as unlawful. They were seen as they were met with a lot of police resistance, and ultimately that police resistance led to a shit ton of violence. And people were talking about the chaos in the exact same terms and in the exact same boundaries as they do right now with respect to the pro-Palestinian encampments. But ultimately, the students are following on the footsteps of those who fought bravely for civil rights and fought bravely against the Vietnam War. In some instances, occupying the exact same spaces.
oh, I mean, like, and I understand that. I have no problem with them doing that, but I do have a problem doing it whenever it's destroying property and taking away other people's education.
But
And
they
I
but
think
they
that's
said
really
that
what.
about the civil rights movement as well, is what I mean. Like they ultimately, I think I'm glad that they had the ends justify the means attitude during the civil rights movement. And I'm glad that they had a ends justify the means attitude during the Vietnam War protests or during the boycott, divestment, and sanctions
I think
protests
those
against.
conflicts are way more complex than that.
Well,
I don't think
BDS is identical. It's the same exact. It's literally like almost definitionally identical. It's a boycott, divestment, and sanctions on apartheid South Africa in 1985. This was also another student-led movement as well, and the methods were identical too. The only difference is South Africa did not have the benefit of having another South Africa that they could learn the mistakes from and make sure that they don't repeat it. Israel had South Africa to look to, so they could like set up a lobbying effort and ensure that the state bends to their will as to the best of their ability, and the media apparatus as well.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely Israel is much more influential than that. I mean, I can see where you're coming from. I think that that type of mindset is very scary to me because while you're right that it does create a lot of positive outcomes, it also creates a lot of negative outcomes as well.
Do you have examples of the negative outcomes? Like as far as a democratically organized revolutionary movement?
What do you mean by that?
Like is
like
there
the negative out like well, I'm just saying
like
that
is there an example that you can give me throughout history where people organized on certain boundaries that were like democratically organized on certain boundaries and they like enforced the tyranny of majority and like something awful happened as a consequence of that?
I'm sure I could think of some. I mean, absolutely. And I think it happens all the time on a very basic level. Like, for example, like during the BLM riots, people were obviously burning down buildings and doing things like that. That's something I don't really support, and I don't think that that's beneficial, and I'm never going to support that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not helping anybody. It's not doing anything for anyone. It's purely destructive, and I don't think that people have the right to do that. I think that yeah, you should have the right to protest, but if you use the justification for the ends justify the means, then I think that anybody can use that justification, and that justification can be used for malicious reasons. And there's the only way to have a world that's fair is to have some sort of generally accepted rules, and that's what we have for laws. And I see where you're coming from with the civil rights movement, but you have to see the perspective that I have too, that if you allow people to just, justify themselves by thinking, well, our cause is righteous, so it's okay for us to do it, it would immediately cause huge amounts of chaos.
Yeah, because no, I understand. This is exactly the same arguments launched against the civil rights movement as well. MLK spoke on this
Yeah.
with great frequency, where in the eyes of those who are being wronged, or in their experiences, not even in their own perspective, their regular existence is chaotic, right? And this is from letter from Birmingham jail where he talks specifically about the white moderate, where he talks about the white moderate who places a timeline on another man's emancipation and another man's justice that says your methods and your means of protest are actually not right, or now is not the time. Where he very specifically talks about people who were naysayers to the civil rights movement who said like, oh no, now is not the time, or things are actually much better than they would be if black people were still enslaved, and there's too much property damage happening. The point is, from their perspective at that time, for black people, especially living in the segregated South or even redlined in the North, America was consistently chaotic, and it still is for many people of color, especially living
it's
in.
important to keep in mind, like you're talking about Martin Luther King, he also explicitly was against blocking transportation, and so there were lines even that he had.
Wait, Martin Luther King also participated in the Montgomery bus boycott.
Let me see if I can.
Right.
I don't know if I can link this.
He led the Montgomery bus boycott for 382 days, which officially ended on December 20th, 1956. That's like,
I sent you a link in the chat.
in the Discord chat?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What is this? Farmer King and Lewis, along with millions of Americans, struggle to figure out what would amount to legitimate, appropriate forms of nonviolent protest. Tactics dramatic enough to make their impact, but not so disruptive as to alienate supporters. Okay. Everyone could agree on the nobility, even the genius of the original sit-ins, conducted with such dignity that their moral power was overwhelming. What is this? At an early press conference, an organizer with King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference declared, "We will tie up public transportation by laying our bodies prostrate on the runways of airports across railroad tracks." This degree of disorder was too much even for King, who walked back the staffer's comments. Over the summer, as the Kennedy administration reversed course to support the march, Rustin realized that attracting hundreds of thousands of marchers he desired meant abandoning the controversial tactics that would alienate the mainstream. In the end, as comedian and activist Dick Gregory said, the march went off like a Sunday church picnic. Ultimately, these protests at the time were still declared disruptive, though. You understand that, right? Like every single instance, including the Montgomery bus boycott, was declared to be disruptive and at the time, and was violently suppressed by the state. Like none of these protests, not a single one of these protests actually was met with hugs and kisses, and the state being like, you know what, you guys are making a sound argument. And at the time, the coverage,
I think that whenever you justify, like you can't just do anything that you want whenever you've decided that you have the moral authority to do that. Like it's very easy to go and look at the civil rights movement and say, well, they did this to an extent, so it's okay for us to do it. But if you apply this to real life, I don't think that it really works. Like just because you're morally aggrieved about something, it doesn't give you the right to destroy other people's property, to stay on their property, or to do things that hurt other people.
Well, the property is not their property. We established that. Like this is, they participated in sit-ins in colleges in the civil rights movement as well. They were doing exactly the same stuff that these students are doing, if not much more militant. There's also another side of the civil rights movement that often doesn't get discussed in mainstream media or in our schools in general, that also played a significant role, according to MLK as well, which was the more militant action where Black people would demonstrate with weapons or directly get into active confrontation with the police and like shootouts and whatnot. Now, that did play a role in increasing pressure points for the state to look at the more reasonable parties, the peaceful demonstrations, and concede to the demands being made by all of the parties. So all of this played an active role. You can't have one without the other, is what I mean. But even in this circumstance, we're looking at only one aspect: the civil disobedience of the civil rights movement.
Right. You're right whenever you say you can't have one without the other, but I don't think that being an inevitability justifies the other. So
but they haven't even reached that point, is what I'm saying. We're currently in the beginning stages. We're currently in the stage where we're getting upset and using ruthless police tactics to stop peaceful demonstrations from occurring. Like these demonstrations have not even met like the civil disobedience metrics of the civil rights movement even.
Yeah, I think that really, I mean, I'll go back to what I said initially. I don't think that a group of students should be able to go into the university and just start camping out there.
But ultimately, the point is like there's nothing that they can do, right? Like, because I asked like, what can they do then? And you said that they should just go to a different university. Well, what happens when that university also has endowments?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, the world is not obligated to appeal to you. The world, like, if other people don't want to do what you want, then it's not like everybody has to find a way that it's okay for you to do that. Like, if other people don't want to agree with you, it's not your right to force them to agree with you. That's crazy.
Yeah, this isn't about forcing other people to agree with you. That's more so about getting the state to follow through on what the majority opinion is in many instances, or in some instances not the majority opinion, but it's like the morally righteous thing to do, like in the civil rights movement. I would say, despite the fact that it was not the majority opinion, I think you and I both agree that the civil rights movement was objectively a good thing, and the methods were infinitely more disruptive at the time than what the pro-Palestinian side has done so far in terms of college
Oh, I
campuses
think
and everywhere around.
that is guaranteed. You're totally right about that. Obviously, it's not as bad as civil rights. It's not even remotely as close. I also don't think it's as extreme. Like obviously, civil rights was something that was happening in America to Americans at that exact moment. What's happening over at Israel is much more disconnected from us. I don't really ever see
Well,
that
the
being on the same level.
disconnection does stem. You're right. One is a domestic issue, one is foreign policy. The disconnection stems from the fact that most people don't really truly understand that, like, as Eisenhower once famously said,
Ultimately,
every dollar,
yeah.
every no, every dollar being spent on a rocket is a dollar that could be spent on building American roads, building
Well,
American
I mean,
bricks.
that's the thing. No, I agree with you. Like I completely agree with you on that. But I think that the way that you stop that is by voting for people that also agree with you and that are going to push those policies through. I don't think that it's reliable enough, and I don't think it's effective enough to try to do what they're doing and hope that because like and I can only speak for like myself and what I've seen. I feel like the way that a lot of those people, the protesters, have conducted themselves and what they're doing, I think a lot of people don't like it. And I feel like it's alienated a lot of different people. And I don't think it's helped at all.
I think that
Um, you-
I think that the mainstream
and,
media definitely massages the narrative in a certain direction. A lot of people probably see
uh,
them and only hear about how anti-Semitic they are, even though that's not the case.
well,
So that
here's
definitely
also
plays a role.
is like I like my community, like obviously that's the viewpoint that I have, right? But like I'm sure your community probably disagrees with me on this. And like,
Yes.
you guys, yeah, yeah, I bet. And so like, yeah, you guys probably have like the opposite, like probably like 90-10 or like 80-20 that I do. And so it's very hard for me really to say for sure. But I do think that by doing that, or like by the protests, like I don't really know if it's really helped the cause hardly at all.
Well,
And I
it
think the
seems like polling is still pretty consistent and consistently favoring the Palestinian side on this matter.
at
That's
least for
just
the that's what you said, yeah.
yeah. So the student led protests have not, as far as I've seen, have not actually changed the public opinion and public attitude. And I'm willing to bet that the violent suppression of the state for these otherwise peaceful demonstrations, no matter how hard the media massages the narrative, will most likely lead to larger and larger demonstrations. There's only too many old white ladies that cops can brutalize because they're saying don't do a genocide in my name until the American public goes, holy shit, okay, this is too far. And the greatest example I can give you is that Israel personally had killed 200 humanitarian aid workers up until a couple of weeks prior. And obviously, that kind of information wasn't really breaching the public consciousness as hard as when Israel killed 7 white aid workers from the World Central Kitchen. That was a big turning point where the majority, even of older people, said, all right, they've gone too far. This is unconscionable. You know, this is beyond the pale. And I
It's
suspect
surprising
that
to me that America pushes Israel so hard. I don't really understand the reason why. I mean, like, of course, it's probably just money, but it's very surprising for me to see it happen. It seems like it's almost there's like a level of dissonance there because
it comes
especially
from
like
strategic interest, strategic importance. Israel is our forward operating base in a resource rich region that
yeah,
that we are very fond of having there. It's destabilizing power against all
yeah.
of these scary enemies that we have that shouldn't really be enemies at all, but we've declared them to be. So that's the reason. That's the major reason as to why we are so unconditionally offering full throated support to Israel, no matter what the fuck they do.
I think that you're completely right, actually. And like, and the reason why I said I don't know is because, like, I'm happy to hear you say that because I've always felt like kind of a conspiracy theorist that like Israel exists basically to, create unrest or destabilize the Middle East. So, it's
Yeah, I
good
mean,
at least,
it's a settler
you
colony. It
you
started
know,
off as a British settler colonial project, and it continued as we took over the torch from the British when we became the dominant global superpower, and we continued that exact same project. And that is the major role that Israel plays for us. It's not like Jews are powerful and monolithically,
Yeah.
in a scary way controlling the media or some shit like that. It's just that like Jews argue with one another all the fucking time. There's a significantly larger group of American evangelical Zionists that are responsible for a lot more donations going into Israel, specifically in places like Texas, as a matter of fact, and all around, all those mega churches in your, around where you live, they are all way bigger dick riders of Israel, despite the fact that they hold anti-Semitic beliefs sometimes
I
themselves.
don't fucking understand it either, man. I
Yeah,
I
no,
don't un- so dumb.
it's a theological justification that they have. They believe that Jesus Christ is going to come back to earth and the rapture is going to happen, and that
They'll be good ones and they go to heaven.
yeah, they Jews will of course burn in hell in that process unless they convert to evangelical Christianity. But this is a good tactical ally for the time being in order to create the conditions for the rapture, which means that all that entire land must be dominated by Jews and Jews only. So that's the overarching goal for a lot of evangelical Zionists in this country, and they far outnumber Jews. This is why I always say, if every single American Jew, and there's 6 million of them, decided tomorrow that like Israel's behavior is unconscionable, and they said, not in our name, we don't want this anymore. If every single Jew in America was anti-Zionist,
Yeah.
Israel would still be allowed to operate in the exact same way, and America would still give Israel all of the fucking money and all of the political power to do whatever the fuck they want to do, because it doesn't have anything to do with American Jews as much as it has something to do with American interest in the region.
Yeah, no, I think that you're right. Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I said that in my chat. I mean, I even said like I don't know if this is going to be a bad take, but I wouldn't have been surprised if the Israel knew that October 7th stuff was going to happen. I wouldn't be surprised if they let it happen.
I don't know if I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I think that it's their arrogance and their
Yeah.
hubris that caused October 7th to happen. The arrogance that they think that they could have an apartheid and violently suppress 5 million Palestinians, 2.5 in Gaza in an open air prison, and 2.5 in the West Bank in permanent occupation with like steady rounds of pogroms and forcible expulsion from their own lands. Without any sort of without incurring any sort of cost to their own security. Many other regional operatives actually informed the Israeli government, and they basically cast it aside, saying Palestinians, they can't do shit. And it turns out they can actually do shit, and that you can't really keep pressuring people over and over again and trap them in like inhumane conditions and expect them not to lash out and retaliate. But it's that very same arrogance, but it is more so arrogance than
That's what.
some conspiracy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, that's why I was kind of curious. Like, what do you think is going to happen? Like, what do you like in 20 years? Like, what do you think the resolution of this is going to be?
I don't know. I genuinely don't know. I think that I've been covering Israel Palestine publicly for the past 10 years. I've been a supporter of Palestinian emancipation, and I've never seen this level of Western support in my entire life. 10 years ago, if you said the things that I'm saying right now, immediately everyone would be like, oh, you're anti Semitic. Fuck off.
Yeah.
And that was very powerful. That was like, that immediately would stop any kind of conversation because nobody wants to be called anti Semitic. The fuck, especially in progressive circles. Like, why?
Yeah.
That is a true form of bigotry, obviously, and one that is ever present.
Well, that's what makes it even worse to accuse without it being true.
Yeah, exactly. And
yeah,
and the fact that like while I was very critical of ADL for a very long time, the fact that there's like actual journalism being conducted on the Apartheid Defense League's hate crime statistics is like wild. This was something that would be considered a non-starter. Even I would, if someone came to me
Yeah.
fucking 5-6 years ago and we're like, let's look at the Jewish hate crime statistics, actually, I'd be like, get the fuck out of here, dude. What
Yeah,
kind of
because
fucking Nazi shit is this?
yeah.
And now you openly do see it, though. Jonathan Greenblatt, the president of ADL, who very famously was caught caught in a phone conversation talking about the dangers that TikTok presents, has changed the designation, directly changed the designation of anti-Semitism to criticisms of Israel. Anytime someone sees a Jewish student, for example, sees a placard that says "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," or "Free Palestine," or whatever, that is now declared an anti-Semitic hate crime. Like, it is unconscionable to weaponize Judaism in an effort to defend the state of Israel and its awful actions against the Palestinian population and everyone around. It's ridiculous, especially when anti-Semitism does increase in times of Israel's like sieges and violent, abhorrent actions in general, like real anti-Semitism.
I see that. I think that's what happens, right? And you see a lot of it on Twitter, right? I mean, uh, somebody I read is getting unbanned now, and so there's going to be a lot more of it.
Yeah, I mean his little fucking groiper shithead fan base is always all around. They've never stopped. So it's not
like
shocking. It's not shocking that Elon Musk would make such a decision. So I don't, I think that is ridiculous, and Elon Musk is like the number one free speech for me, not for the ass dude in general. He also claims to be a champion of free speech, but routinely suppresses speech that he doesn't like, that bother him. Talks about community notes, but then literally will take down community notes from his own form of misinformation, and he does it in like very thin-skinned ways.
Notes. I am a huge fan of community notes.
Yeah, but community notes work if they're not, one, brigaded, and two, community notes work if you can also do community notes on Elon Musk, or community notes on like the chain, for example. A cop after Columbia University showed up on Morning Joe and was like, "This is a chain that we found on all the doors in Hamilton Hall." And he claimed that was the reason why they believed that it was outside agitators that were participating in the sit-in, that were participating in the takeover of Hamilton Hall. The community notes immediately swarmed it and were like, "What the fuck are you talking about? That chain is literally
like on
discount." That chain is literally on discount on the Columbia Public Safety website, and that community note perished suspiciously. So, community notes in that situation, if you have it for some but not all, can still serve a very nefarious propaganda purpose. It makes you feel like there's counters. What's up?
If only one side is getting fact checked, then you might as well not do it.
Well, I mean, I'm in favor of community notes. I'm just saying that, like,
they should be
to always keep in consideration.
That, if Elon Musk is deleting his own community notes, that's stupid as fuck. Absolutely.
Exactly. And I think that is like, because then there's a much more nefarious reason for community notes. So then it makes people falsely believe that, well, there's no community notes on this, so it must be real, right?
Yeah. Oh no, I think that definitely happens. Yeah. I mean, I like it, but I'm a fan of community notes, but I think that there are always going to be drawbacks to things, and I think that is one of them. You're right.
Just like free speech, there's always free speech for peaceful demonstration and peaceful protest when, Nazis or whoever the fuck want to do it. But if you don't have it for the other side, if you don't have it for, people who want to criticize Israel, even if they aren't being anti-Semitic, then all of a sudden,
about the was it like 2 days ago? Yeah, with like all those people attacking the encampment. Like, if you don't like the encampment, that's fine, but it's not your decision to make whether they should be there or not.
Yeah. But like I said, that's also why I don't believe that the university should have taken the actions that it took and then lied under false premises to the students to act like the police presence that they brought about the encampment was actually for their own good, for their own benefit, for their own safety. Be honest about it. Be like, yeah, we don't like that you fucking have a tent in the middle of the courtyard, and we need you to shut the fuck up, please. I mean,
Yeah.
I would of course still support the students, and I would still get very mad, but ultimately, at least they be honest in why they're doing it.
I agree with you. And yeah, I mean, I think that, it's a matter of degree. And, to me, I think that, some things are over the line. If you don't think that, then that's kind of like your opinion, and that's fine. But uh, I do hope that they can keep protesting without doing anything crazy, right? I mean, like I think it's a good cause.
They will most likely go back and do encampments. They will continue protesting, very likely in probably
Yeah.
larger numbers now that the police have responded in such brutal ways, which will inevitably force the university's hand to take action in the positive direction. This is usually how it goes, at least throughout history. That's usually how it's worked out.
Yeah. I mean, we'll just have to wait and see. I actually the river from the river to the sea, a lot of people think that's a genocide chant. Is it?
No, it is
Well, I
a.
mean, but I mean, the thing is, man, like I'm gonna be honest, I think it is, and that's why I'm asking you.
Why do you think it is?
Well, the reason why I think it is because if you go from the river from the sea to the sea, you would have to get rid of Israel, wouldn't you?
No, it means Palestine will be free, as in Palestinians will have dignity and will have humanity and will have civil liberties. It doesn't mean that, like, the Jews that live there have to go away.
So you think that that saying doesn't have anything to do with like getting rid of Israel or anything like that?
I think that Israel, in the current formation, in the way that it exists currently as an apartheid regime, yes, that must not exist. I do agree. That should be abolished. And I think that's what that slogan means. And for many people who are like, no, I'm really fond of Israel the way it currently is, they basically attribute living alongside Palestinians with like full rights and civil liberties would be akin to the genocide. It's ridiculous, but unfortunately, that is an attitude that is ever present. And maybe even normally I would consider it to be borderline hysterical, which I still think it is hysterical. However, it doesn't take away from the fact that people do legitimately believe that. Like, they do think that if Israel is not like a Jewish supremacist ethno state, that, like, I think a lot of people do, as a consequence of social conditioning, legitimately believe that if it's no longer an ethno state, then, like, Holocaust 2 Electric Boogaloo for sure.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that's why like because I mean, like everybody that I've like heard like talking about it, like that's kind of the implication is like they say, "Oh, it's a genocide." And I I pretty much assumed that you wouldn't think that. That's why I asked you because it's
I
like
don't.
I've never really heard like another perspective on it. I was curious.
It's another way to just try and suppress any kind of protest, because ultimately the goal isn't to make sure that the optics of the Palestinian side is actually super intact and super viable. The goal is to get him to shut the fuck up. So
Yeah.
you're going to do whatever you can, and use whatever organs of the government you can to tell them to shut the fuck up in different ways. It's a multi-prong approach. It's ironic because, like, from the river to the sea, Israel is all you'll see is one, the early Likud charter. Likud is the party that Benjamin Netanyahu um is the leader of, and I think it's like literally Benjamin Netanyahu has said that as well. And it's ironic because, like, they are doing the genocide. The Israeli side is doing the genocide. So for them to say it, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, that does become like a very real, very active genocide in that situation. I think that overall, though, like, hyper focusing on these sorts of slogans and saying that they're genocidal inherently is just another way to try and put hurdles on the Palestinian side of the protests.
It's not really productive and it doesn't really it doesn't really lead to any conversation. It's just a way to shut down what somebody else is saying. I think that you're
Yeah,
right. I think it's the same thing with like calling things anti-Semitic.
yeah,
It's like
no,
people
it
say that
is. Yeah,
people to stop talking about it. That's the goal.
Yeah, absolutely. And Congress is now also, you know, instead of saying, "Hey, man, this stuff is really unpopular by
Yeah.
the broadest American populations, like unlike anything else. Maybe we should, I don't know, dial it back a little bit. Maybe we should restrain Israel, which would not exist as a state without our, you know, consistent aid."
Yes.
And instead of doing all that, Congress has only moved in one direction and one direction only. Uh,
Yeah.
Tom Cotton, senator from Arkansas, earlier today was talking about how like these guys are all jihadis. These are little Gazas. They're disgusting Islamists. Like talking about the American protesters that are pro-Palestinian, pro-Palestine, and like that never gets a censure. But Rashida Tlaib, the Palestinian congresswoman, saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, that gets censured. So it's always one direction in the American government, and unfortunately, it's not a good direction.
I think what's scary about it is that it seems like it's very much not representative, at least from what I see on social media.
Well, there's a reason why Congress is always barely treading above a 30% approval rating. It's because we all inherently, no matter what our political positions are, we all inherently understand that these fucking politicians don't actually represent our interests at all and only represent the interests of corporations and the wealthy. And the military industrial complex is a very viable, perhaps the most viable constituency. So they care about that a lot more than they care about, I don't know, healthcare or roads or
It's
infrastructure.
fucking crazy. Like I don't know. Like I mean again, I think that a lot of times like I might disagree with you on like kind of like the methodology of the protest, but I agree with you about these problems. I think that they're very fucking legitimate. And I hope people finally I wish more people would actually vote and actually be activists, actually do something or talk about it.
Well, a lot of the people that do participate in activism are oftentimes also the very same people that do go out and vote. Contrary to what popular opinion is, those are the guys who are at the forefront of voting. Many
Well,
people always
I mean,
say,
like,
I'm
I know
anti
they're not.
voting. I'm not. I
Oh,
love
oh yeah,
voting.
no, you're not anti-voting, right? I know that. It's just that I think that it's just disappointing because yeah, sure, like probably a lot of people that are watching this stream, people that are watching maybe my stream and especially your stream, like they vote, but it's all the other demoralized people that don't
Yeah,
do
but
anything
in
and
that
just let things
situation, I do think that it's the fault of our politicians because you got to give people something to vote for. People aren't civic minded, especially in the United States of America, where we don't even have compulsory voting. And on top of not having compulsory voting, we have deliberately made attempts to make voting as hard as possible. One of the easiest ways to increase voter participation, like we did in the 2020 elections, is to make voting easier. Universal ballot access, mail in ballot access, universal voter registration. Those were two reasons why the 2020 elections had the highest voter participation in decades. So there are many initiatives out there specifically to stop people from going out to vote. But beyond that, I think one thing that the politicians could do, especially the Democratic Party could do, is to give people something to vote for, to show people that like when you do vote for us, we won't go back on our promises that we made, and we will follow through, and we won't leave your ass in the fucking dark, and we will do our very hardest to fight for your rights and your civil liberties with the same intensity that the Republicans regularly fight to take away people's civil liberties. And I think they do a
well
really good job at it.
they do give people this something to fight for, right? You look at like Trump in 2016, it gave people something to fight for,
Yeah.
even if it's misguided or you disagree with it. And Bernie Sanders gave people something to fight for. And I think that you're right. And I don't know
That would
why.
definitely like not putting Hillary Clinton up would be a great way to
I,
fucking
I,
motivate
don't
people
know,
to go out and vote.
I don't know why. It's, man, that's
Well,
crazy.
because ultimately when it comes down to it, I am a firm believer that we do obviously have disagreements. Like the Democratic Party and the Republican Party definitely does have policy disagreements, but ultimately on matters that pertain to the economy broadly or deregulation, or more importantly than both of those things, war endless war, there is always bipartisan support. Just like there's always money in the banana stand for more war. Never any money
Yeah.
for healthcare. Never any money for, infrastructure spending, but certainly a shit ton of money for war and more war. That's what I think.
Yeah. I don't know how it keeps happening, honestly. I think that the problem is that, like, it's like you ask yourself, why are people not out at the Capitol right now, demanding immediate resignations? And then somebody says, well, it's because you're not there. And it's like, well, you're not there because they're not there. And then, it's just 2 or 4 more years of the same thing. It's very hard to know how to, like, motivate people to feel like they have any sort of real control over things.
Yeah, absolutely. And but that goes back to exactly what I was saying with respect to these protests, the pro-Palestinian protests, because it gets people very motivated.
I do. I see your perspective. I mean, again, like, if I might disagree on the intensity of it or the amount of it that you're doing, that's really kind of I think that's not really a big point. Overall, I do want to see more people protesting this stuff because I think it's a huge waste of everybody's fucking money. And like,
Yeah.
you're like, I'm the same as you, right? Like, we're both paying a lot of fucking money in taxes and it's getting wasted.
Bro, you're about to, you keep talking, you're about to fucking participate in the Austin, Texas protest, dude. What's happening? Are we about to see you next to Milena and Caroline next time at the Palestinian demonstrations?
About 15 years ago, you would have. I signed up to work at Greenpeace to promote Planned Parenthood and all this other stuff in like 2009. Yeah.
Damn, that's crazy.
I had like an Obama poster in my house and everything. And, I was always very political, and, I was a big promoter of that stuff. And, like, I absolutely support it. Yeah, I mean, that's why I talk about it, right? I mean, because I know that, it's the same with you, right? I mean, like, you get so much fucking hate. Like, I get people that are mad at me all the fucking time. And it's like, you still do it, and at least I still do it because it's like, this is what I believe in. I want to do this. And, if people are going to get mad at me for it, then that's just the price you pay.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. There's definitely more of that. There's definitely more of a price than just people getting mad at you, but it is what it is,
Yeah.
All right. Well, I gotta go pee, but thank you for coming on.
Chipotle soon. So yeah, I've got a very busy day ahead of me.
All right. Have a good one.
Thanks. I had a good time. I hope the chat enjoyed it too.
Yeah. All right. Bye.
Peace.
All right. That was Asmongold on protests and methods.